Yes.
All right, do you think?
So we hear Bryan there telling you, don't say anything more to her that's incriminating for me, and then he says, do your thing. You remember that?
I don't specifically remember it, but I just heard it, so yes.
And ma'am, like I said, I say all that just because I can't imagine how hard it is, but we got to get through this somehow, and I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. You and I have never, other than the last time you were on the stand, you and I have never spoken before outside these walls. Is that right? You have spoken to a couple people. You've spoken with the ranger in this case, right? Remember him talking to you some on the phone, I think it was, or that day?
There.
Okay. And you spoke to a detective with Frisco, I think that day. Detective Degg's the one that came to your office?
Oh, yes, sir.
And you talked to the Dr. McGarrahan, the neuropsych, the doctor that the jury's going to hear from in a little while?
Yes, sir.
And you told her that no prenatal complications, no birth complications, went home together after a short time, right?
Yes, I guess.
You told her that that Bryan Cahill was not sexually or physically abused in the home growing up, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we shouldn't expect any doctor's opinions based on father, strangling son, headbutting son, stuff like that, like we see in some cases. That wasn't going on in your household when the boys were young, correct?
I don't know what went on between Bryan and his dad when they were having confrontations. I am not sure. I don't think I can speak to that.
Okay. Well, I mean, we heard very clearly that you remembered some confrontation at 14 that you said was kind of like the first physical deal that you saw between the dad and the son, and it was the father knocking the son down. That was like the first physical confrontation you saw between Bryan and the father, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if there had been other physical confrontations, if he had been an abusive father, a drunk, you would have seen that, right?
Yes, if it was to that extent, yes.
I mean, if anything, you've kind of told us that he was an absent father, if anything, right?
A great deal of the time, yes.
Okay. I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just saying, so that we can move to the things that do matter, let's stick to kind of move aside the things sometimes we see in these types of cases that don't. So we're not dealing with someone who was raised in that abusive home. Bryan Cahill, it seems to me like you did the very best y'all could for him in a lot of different fashions, right?
I certainly did, yes.
Okay. We moved through it kind of quickly, but you had mentioned first the fence post incident. You remember that one?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the fence post incident, Bryan gets hit with a fence post. You said you saw a bump on his head, and you called the doctor, correct?
Yes.
Doctor said observe him, and from your memory, nothing really ever came of that. Must have been fine, right?
As far as I know, yes.
Because obviously, if you had started seeing signs of concussion with Bryan, I mean, Bryan would have been taken to a hospital.
Right? Yes, sir.
Okay. After the fence post incident, we have him testing at Stell. You remember that, the 86, 87 time?
Yes, sir.
Above average academics, high IQ. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You had mentioned, and like I said, we went through this kind of quickly, you had mentioned that he had a friend that concerned you. You remember talking about that?
Yes, sir.
And you said you didn't want to give the name, right?
Correct.
Okay. That was Andy, right? We don't have to say his last name, but that was Andy, right?
Yes, sir.
And And just so the jury understands, your concern was because you started finding out he and Andy are harming animals, right?
Yes, sir.
It wasn't about dead animals and rituals and that kind of thing?
There was someone else in that family who was doing that. It was not Bryan and Andy.
Oh, okay. Bryan was then sent in 1990 to Diagnoses, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so the jury understands that's in Payson, Arizona. It's a treatment, or it's a wilderness program that believes nature is a healer, right? It's based on a Native American term, and the programming is basically that there's healing in nature, right?
That's part of it, but it's not the main thing.
And they're also very good at incorporating the parents with their programming.
Yes, sir.
You were having behavioral problems at that point in 1990, and we're hoping, hey, maybe this can get us past some of that, right?
Yes.
All right. Then I believe after that is when he is. I think you said he went a second time, and then the behavior is continuing, and he ends up. You and your husband end up putting him in Green Oaks. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And in Green Oaks, Green Oaks is a facility that has doctors, nurses, and is there to provide mental health care to individuals. Right?
Yes, I think at the time they were doing that, plus maybe some drug and alcohol.
Okay. Then you said that I believe 92. He's seen some different. You're looking for different solutions, trying to find a solution, and it's in 92 that we talked about the Oaks and a counselor come in and him running out the bathroom, right?
Yes, sir.
Do you remember on April 30th of 1996 the police being called out to your house?
I don't remember a date. I'd have to have more information than that.
I apologize. I'll keep going. If at any time I ask you something and I'm not giving you enough background, please let me know, because I don't want to ask you questions. This is tough, going back to 96, I'm sure. You remember mentioning to Mr. Haynes when he was asking you about an incident where you said it was a confrontation with the dad, and that Plano came out and there were discussions about charging with a misdemeanor. You remember all that you told Mr. Haynes?
Yes.
Okay. The truth is that call to Plano on April 30th of 1996 was because Bryan physically assaulted you, isn't it?
No, I think he pushed me. I think he pushed me, but he didn't assault me.
May I approach the witness, Judge? Ma'am, I don't want to mince too many words, but do you remember writing a statement?
I don't. I do remember this. No, he did push me, but I don't know anything else.
Bryan Cahill on April 1st, 1996 physically pushed you, correct?
Yes, I believe he did push me.
And you told Plano police officers that evening that you felt pain. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember saying that I felt pain. Did I say that in there?
Your statement?
Mm-hmm.
No, the jury's already heard from the police officer you said it to, ma'am.
I don't remember saying that I felt pain unless they asked me that question in some way.
And when Plano tried to do a misdemeanor assault on Bryan, you went and filed what's called an affidavit of non-prosecution so he wouldn't have charges, correct?
I don't remember how that played out. I think he was charged with something. I don't know.
And that was also one of the factors that led to Bryan Cahill's commitment, mental health commitment through Collin County.
Yeah, I don't know what that whole process was, but yes, I followed whatever they told me to follow in order to do that.
Well, if that happened April 30th of 1996, and a hearing on Bryan Cahill's temporary mental health services was to be held on May 2nd of 1996. Those are right next to each other, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, there's a couple things about this mental health commitment that I want to make sure we're clear with the jury about. You had mentioned to the jury that it had scared you because Bryan had ordered a gun through the mail, correct?
Yes.
There was more to that, wasn't there?
I don't quite understand the question.
Bryan had threatened to kill you.
No, I don't think he threatened to kill me.
Well, let me rephrase. Bryan had threatened to do harm to you, correct?
I don't recall that now. Other than him pushing me, I don't recall.
You know, actually, Judge, can I put this on the Elmo? That way the jury can see what I'm looking at. And Ms. Cahill, again, I'm not trying to make this harder than it needs to be, but you understand the jury's got to know what we were dealing with and when we were dealing with it. Is that fair?
Yes, I just don't remember that far back. I'm sorry.
Okay. I mean, you remember answering questions from Mr. Haynes about the mental health commitment and the gun, right?
Yes, I do remember answering this.
Defendant's Exhibit number 4. And you remember telling Mr. Haynes that it was a Dr. James Bennett? You remember the name Bennett?
Yes, I do.
Okay. There at number 9, ordering a gun, receiving it by mail in the home, threatening bodily harm to mother and father and himself, has destroyed the windshield of his car and removed parts of car. It wasn't just that he ordered the gun. At this time, he was threatening to harm you and your husband and himself, correct?
I don't know if Dr. Bennett was talking about a particular incident or if he was putting together several different things.
Well, he had already pushed you 2 days or 3 days before.
I think that's what he was probably speaking about.
Well, I guess my only issue with that would be, did you know that Dr. Bennett went further and put on number 3, mental status examination reveals paranoid ideations, delusional, and B, homicidal ideations. How old was Bryan Cahill in 1996?
19, almost 20.
And at that time, he was found to be a danger to himself and others by a psychotic disorder. Is that your understanding at the time?
Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to say things were maybe a little bit more serious in these late 80s and these early 90s than maybe we've talked about so far today?
No, I don't think they were more serious at that time, no.
They were serious enough that you and your husband agreed to seek the help of Collin County because your son had access to a weapon?
At that time, yes. I thought you were talking about 10 years before. I thought you said the late 80s and early 90s.
Well, I guess we've already kind of gone through some issues you had behaviorally, some issues you had with this friend Andy. Now we're getting into the 90s. I mean, this wasn't something that just sprung up after he got hit with a fence post, right?
We're talking about a long span of years there. Yeah, I don't know.
And also, I guess in that time, that was when the motorcycle accident that you don't really know anything about firsthand, but that motorcycle accident happened, right?
Probably somewhere around, I don't know, maybe 14 or somewhere in that age, yeah.
And in that motorcycle accident, it was kind of the same protocol. You called the doctor, they told you to observe, and obviously if there had been signs of a concussion, any of those types of issues, you would have taken him to a hospital, right?
If I knew about it, yes.
Are you saying you don't know that he actually had a motorcycle accident, or are you saying you would?
If I realized how serious it was, yeah.
Okay, so obviously, I mean, I don't think anyone in the courtroom's questioning how caring of a mother you are. If he had been having symptoms of a concussion after you had called a doctor, you would have taken that seriously and you would have rushed him to a hospital.
If I knew that he had those symptoms, yes.
And after calling a doctor, you would have been looking for him, right?
Yes, if he was at home, yes, I would have been looking for them. I don't, yeah.
14, was he living somewhere else?
No, sir, I'm just saying that if he was in the house at the time, I would have.
Okay. So then let's talk a little bit about 1996. The jury just heard about April 30th of 1996. They heard about the commitment. Now, and so at that time, you knew that, oh gosh, we've got a gun involved. We've got someone who suffers from mental illness. Maybe we don't know exactly what, and is threatening. In that situation, that's serious enough to get Collin County involved and get him to some mental health services, right?
Yes.
Gun, mental health, get Collin County involved. Right?
Yes.
Right. And I believe you told the jury that from that point, he went to place in McKinney first, and then he ended up going to Baylor in Richardson.
I don't remember the exact way that transpired, but yes, I think the hospital in McKinney may have been part of the Baylor system. I don't remember how all that played out.
Okay. Was he actually supposed to go to Wichita Falls State Hospital at some point?
No.
Okay. That was just in the paperwork, but it never was part of the plan.
I didn't know it was in the paperwork, but I'm not aware that that ever came up.
Okay. And so during 1996, you'd agree with me that he was being admitted and seen through the Baylor hospital system.
Yes.
In fact, in May, September, and October, he had been admitted in the Baylor hospital system.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I'm going to do my best to give you the information you need to try to remember this stuff, but you'll agree with me, like, when you spoke with Mr. Haynes, y'all weren't going through 1996 as far as what you were dealing with Bryan this morning, have you? Let me rephrase that. I'm sorry. And let me slow down. I feel like I'm moving a little too fast. Y'all talked about his commitment in 1996, and y'all talked about some of the things that you did through 1996, but I don't remember you talking about Bryan's behavior in the home and the interaction of police. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that right now, if we could. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We heard about April 30th of 1996. We heard about the commitment. Then we heard about how he went to Baylor, and I believe you told Mr. Haynes that things got better. Is that right?
There were times when it was better, yeah.
Do you remember on July 3rd of 1996, so just a couple months after that, Bryan's 19 years and 11 months old, that you calling the police, Christine Cahill calling the police because Bryan slapped you on the back after you had taken the car keys away, and that you told police he was intoxicated. Remember calling him because he slapped you on the back and was intoxicated?
Specifically, I remember that now.
Does it help if I tell you Officer Daniel Beck was the Plano police officer who responded?
It doesn't really mean anything to me now, but
Okay.
if I did.
Would it surprise you if you did not want to pursue charges?
No, I would not have wanted to pursue charges.
Okay. We said May, September, and October, he's being seen by staff at Baylor. Do you remember, and during this time, I think you testified that he was also being seen by Solutions Outpatient Services in 96 through 97, is that correct?
I think that's the right date, yeah.
Okay. And you said that was helping. That's another place where we've got a team of doctors, nurses, counseling, treatment, trying to help Bryan, correct?
There's just counselors there. Yeah.
Okay. But at Baylor, there's doctors.
Yes, sir.
Okay. October 20th of 1996, he's now 20 years old and 3 months. Do you remember police coming out because you and your son John were present, that you had found his beer and removed it, telling the officers that it aggravates his mental instability, that he grabbed you by the arms and shouted threats, and then he went and broke a car window? You remember that time?
Yes, it must have happened. I don't really remember it.
Is it that it's too far, it's been too much time, or is it that there were just so many that it's hard to remember them?
I think it's just been too long.
Okay. So then I'll keep going, because it was just too many of them. We could probably have just agreed to the amount. But on that one, you would not tell the officers what the threats were, and again, you said you didn't want to pursue charges, even criminal mischief charges for breaking the window. Does that sound familiar? Officers Danny Perazzo and Officer Ewell, does that help? Ma'am? Okay.
I do remember having the police come once, but I didn't remember all of that. No, sir.
And ma'am, I'm not, just so we're clear, I'm not asking you necessarily because I'm expecting it, but again, it's only fair if the jury gets to hear what's going on with you during this time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
6 days later, October 26th of 1996, officers again dispatched. This is an officer named Michael Schoonover. Do you remember him? Guy from Louisiana. He was called because Bryan was at the home threatening your family. He had just gotten out of a psychiatric ward, which would match up with the Baylor system, and you had told them that he's on medication. For that time?
I don't remember that time now.
February 28th of 1997, and this ended up being one of those days where multiple calls are made because from your house, and I think actually this time John's calling the police. John, his older brother, they're dispatched to a family disturbance because he's there, he's intoxicated, and he's threatening to hurt you, your husband, and John. February 28th of 1997, do you remember that? John having to call a couple times and the police coming out and then leaving and coming back?
I don't remember that.
I'm sorry, I need you to pull that mic a little bit.
I'm sorry, I don't remember that.
It's okay. There's no need to apologize. I just need to ask you about what's happened so the jury understands these years. July of 1997, July 18th, you called the police saying that Bryan's so enraged that you wouldn't give him more Klonopin. Do you remember he was on Klonopin in 97?
I remember it. I do remember a problem with the Klonopin, yes. I do remember that now that you say that, yeah.
And when you're reporting to the police he's intoxicated, is that usually alcohol or is it sometimes drugs and sometimes alcohol?
I don't remember clearly. I'm thinking maybe it's alcohol, but I don't know for sure. Okay. I don't remember the incident.
But that time, he was so enraged that you wouldn't give him more Klonopin than he was prescribed, that he came at you as if to strike you and cornered you. John had to come in, and when the police were called, Bryan ran on foot. Do you remember that one?
I think I do remember something about him running off. Yeah, I do know that you say that, yeah.
And then the next day, them having to come back because he was intoxicated again and threatening you. That was Michael Schoonover another time.
I remember that it happened so many times.
That's okay. And maybe it's best. You would agree with me. I mean, one, you did not want Bryan Cahill in the criminal justice system. I mean, that's not what you wanted, right? And so it must have taken some fear on your part or your family's part to be calling the Plano police to your house because of Bryan, right?
I'm sure it was, yeah.
The drug use was consistent through his older teens into adulthood, is that right?
Through his teens, I don't know about past that.
You just knew about alcohol and marijuana?
In his teens, yes.
He didn't tell you that he and some of the kids in the neighborhood were using LSD?
I learned later, but I didn't know at the time, no.
You talked briefly about sending him to Michael's house. When he left Michael's house to go to Spring Lake Ranch, in fact, they told you that he was being cooperatively resistant to the program. He was resistant to extending his treatment and refused to enroll in sober living. Remember that?
Yeah, I guess that was the reason probably that they wanted him to go to another program.
I mean, again...
I remember that they had some concerns about him coming back into his old neighborhood.
And again, I mean, he's an adult. You've got him in a treatment facility. It's his choice to try to work the program or not. And at least as far as Michael's house, he was being uncooperative, and so we went to the next thing. All right? Michael's house was the one in Palm Springs, California?
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned him working. The last thing I saw was a job that he held from May to August of 2000. What jobs did he work after the year 2000?
After 2000, I think most of the time he worked for his dad, probably most of the time. I think he had a few maybe fast food restaurants or something of that sort too.
He had trouble keeping steady employment, right? Other than working for his dad.
Yes.
And in fact, at some point, y'all started supporting him, didn't you?
We did. He was working for his dad, but yes, we did start to do that more and more.
Well, and the reason I say that is because I know that you signed and paid for the apartment in La Valencia. Did you sign and pay for the apartment on Frankfurt?
I believe I did initially the first year. I think it was required to have a co-signer, and I co-signed for him.
You would agree with me that he's had problems with his family members?
At times he has, sometimes not.
And I know that this is probably not something you want to talk about, but you know that John was interviewed, right?
No, I don't know that he was.
You didn't know that John went to Frisco PD on March 29th of 2019 and spoke with officers?
John was with me. He came to the Frisco Police Department with me that night.
You know that, have you seen the body cam of him being talked to by the same detective in a different room that was talking to you? Detective Deggs? Okay. Has John told you that myself and my investigator tried to speak with him in his home? Did he tell you that?
No, sir.
John had cut off Bryan for quite some time, hadn't he? Hadn't he?
I don't, he cut him, I don't know, you'll have to be more specific than that. I don't understand.
Then let me be very specific.
Mm-hmm.
John cut ties with Bryan Cahill when Bryan Cahill sexualized his 6-year-old stepdaughter, didn't he?
Bryan never sexualized his 6-year-old stepdaughter.
Bryan did not say that he believed that the 6-year-old stepdaughter of John Cahill was saying sexual things to him. He did, didn't he?
Would you like me to explain that? Yes, I will explain, yes, that...
I've asked you a yes or no question.
That's a no question, yes.
So Bryan Cahill did not tell John and the family that the 6-year-old was saying things of a sexual nature to him. Yes or no?
I did not hear that. I know that the 6-year-old was being coached by someone else to do those things.
And because of what Bryan said, John cut him off and hadn't talked to him for about a decade and blocked his number.
No, that's not true. That is not true. I can tell you that for sure. Bryan was at John's house for Christmas.
The 6-year-old was coached. Is that what you're telling the jury?
There was someone in the household who...
It wasn't the individual in the courtroom who believes that CIA is in the room and suffers from paranoid delusion. It was some other person who set that whole thing.
No, I saw myself sometimes that person did that, yes. I will definitely don't agree with that one.
And is that as honest as you were to Judge Smith when you were asking for him to release Bryan Cahill into the public about how he treated you and how he respected you? Let me rephrase. Should we believe that answer as much as we believe those answers on that day?
That day that I came in here for that hearing,
yes, sir.
I did not receive any preparation to be in the courtroom. I had no idea what was going to happen, and I did not know what my questions...
Ma'am, please.
Did the management at La Valencia let you know that Bryan was spitting at children?
No.
Did the management at La Valencia let you know that he was spitting at an African-American 15-year-old named Travion Bryant and calling him the N-word?
No.
You would agree with me that in his jail calls, there's quite a bit of discussion where the N-word is used, where there are racist comments. Is that just part of the way Bryan's personality works?
I don't think I can speak to how his personality works.
Okay. You'd agree with me that there's a lot of discussion using the N-word and using racial terms, correct?
He does, yes.
there's a lot of discussion about Nazi stuff, too. Was he a big history buff?
He does read history, yes.
Moving to our offense, did you know that he was stockpiling weapons and ammo?
I knew that he had some. I knew that he had some.
You knew that he had weapons?
I knew he had a gun.
You were only aware of one?
I thought that he could have two, but I didn't know. I know that he had one.
Okay. After everything you had seen with Bryan over the years, did you think it was a good idea or a bad idea for Bryan to have weapons?
I would say that after he came back from Vermont in 2000, that I wouldn't have seen anything that would necessarily have made that seem to be an issue for a very long time.
You wouldn't see that in 1996 when he was found to have psychotic disorder, homicidal ideations, and ordering a gun through the mail, that then, I mean, you were going with him to his visits to Dr. Hamilton, weren't you? I
went for a number of them, yes.
And you would ask Dr. Hamilton to test him for things like ADHD, and you brought up autism with him and those kind of things, right?
I don't remember the ADHD. I think I may have mentioned at some point whether we could do some testing, yes.
You don't believe
other issues.
You don't believe Bryan Cahill has autism, do you?
I do not know.
When you were talking to the jury about him having fine motor skill issues growing up, but then playing cello, you're not trying to suggest to the jury that he has some type of inability to use limbs in a normal way or anything like that, are you?
I don't think I understand the question. Could you restate that?
Let me put it this way, Jan. Try to do it the best I can to where we can talk about it. You know, I've got a son who has been diagnosed with mild CP, cerebral palsy. His limbs don't bend right. He has trouble with fine motor skills. Is that the kind of thing you saw, or did Bryan Cahill in his early years, he was able to play sports, he was able to play the cello, he was able to play outside, ride motorcycles, and do the things that we would expect him to do, right?
Yes.
And so anything with regards to testimony about occupational therapy, that may be trying to get better about some things, but you weren't saying he had some kind of disability. You weren't trying to suggest that.
I don't really understand the question. I guess
Okay. So you knew that he had at least one weapon. You knew that he had ammo, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. On December 14th of 2018, you weren't the only one who called a police department that day, were you? John Cahill called the McKinney Police Department that day too, didn't he? Were you aware of that?
The date was what?
December 14th of 2018. It's the first time you called Frisco.
I don't think I was aware of that.
You didn't know that Bryan Cahill had left John messages talking about Devil's Day and threatening to kill him?
I do remember a time. I didn't remember it was that time.
And you took it seriously, right? I mean, you took it seriously that Bryan was threatening to harm you, was threatening to harm his brother, was off his medication, and had access to weapons. You took that seriously?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You took it seriously when Bryan Cahill was threatening to kill his neighbors. You called Frisco.
Yes, sir.
And again, who knows whether anything could have stopped anything, but you never did go to the courthouse and say, I mean, I understand that you would have had to have driven it from here to Frisco, but you never went and got that warrant so that Bryan Cahill would have been taken into custody and being evaluated, did you?
They told me that he would not be taken into custody. They told me that the police could go out there and try to talk to him, and that if he would answer, then they would talk to him. But if he didn't answer the door, there was nothing they could do.
Ma'am, you're telling me that staff sitting in that court on the first floor told you that if a judge issued a warrant, cops couldn't go get him?
They told me that if I went and they made a complaint, the judge it would probably take a couple of times for him to respond, and then that they would hand me that paperwork and I would have to go to Frisco Police, and then they would go out and see if they could get a response from Bryan or not.
Would it have been worth it?
They had already been out, and he hadn't responded, so it was clear that that was not going to work.
You know that he's been taking his meds since he's been in jail, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the jury, everything they've seen, the way he treats you, the way he goes after other people, that's on his medication, the same medication he was prescribed by Dr. Hamilton. You understand that?
I understand that.
And you understand that he's being seen by a psychiatrist and MD with regards to the medication that he's on. You understand that?
In the jail?
You know that?
I know that he was getting the medication, yes.
You didn't know that we have doctors who see him on a regular basis?
No, I didn't realize that.
Did you know that he's not in 24-hour lockdown, like he told you? 23, I forgot which one it was.
That he's not?
Yes.
I know that he came out of it about a couple months ago, but he's visited it for 2 years.
Remember when he told you that on that first time you visited him in jail, well, they're not going to take the contacts. And you're like, well, they told me they would. Remember that?
No, sir, I don't remember the occasion. You'll have to tell me more.
Do you remember when he tells you early on about how they charge him for things and that you need to keep putting more money on his books?
Yeah, I don't specifically remember the event.
Since he's been in jail, and especially after the bond hearing we had, you have continually encouraged him to stop talking the way he talks and stop saying the things he says, because you know it's going to look bad, right?
I don't think it's just because it's going to look bad.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, I'll be more clear. Judge, can I have my computer on?
I do tell him that, yes, that it will be used, but that's not the only reason.
I'll play you a jail call for April 15th of 21.
I'm not going to stop. I'm never going to stop. You can never stop me. Okay? Hello?
That'll sound really good when that gets played.
And you were begging him to stop, and he let you know, I'm never going to stop. You can never stop me. And your response is, that's going to sound really good when it gets played, right?
Mm-hmm.
You remember that? And you understand, and you have tried your best to tell him, stop this behavior, but you haven't been able to stop it, have you?
No, sir.
He has had a desire to get out of jail since day one. I mean, we saw it the first day. He's explaining to you how bail works and how it's percentages, and it's not the full amount. You remember that conversation?
Oh, I don't.
Yes?
No, sir, I don't remember that specific conversation.
But you'd agree with me, there's a lot of conversations where he's talking to you about getting out, right?
Yes.
A lot of conversations where he's talking to you about coming home and living with you, right?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that in some ways Bryan is manipulative?
Yes.
Do you remember here recently, I mean, like, I'm talking last month, maybe the 31st of last month, where he's cussing at you, he's getting upset, and you tell him again, don't say these things. They're listening to this. Don't say these things. And Bryan Cahill tells you they can't listen to all this stuff. They don't have enough time to listen to all these calls. Do you remember that conversation?
Not specifically that conversation, but it probably came.
I mean, it's not like Bryan Cahill isn't a smart individual. It's not like Bryan Cahill isn't someone who is able to weigh the pros and cons of actions. You know, in that call with you, he's sitting there saying, I can get away with this because they're never going to be listening to everything. You remember that conversation? It was just the 31st of last month.
I can remember some conversations like that.
It's also true that Bryan focuses his anger at individuals, right? Not just you.
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me.
How many calls have you had to sit there and try to talk him down when he's either really, going off on his father or going off on John Cahill? Just, I mean, they are the focus of his attention, and he is going off on them. That's a lot of calls, right?
There have been some, yes.
He's had a couple calls where he's talking to you about me, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, referring to me by my name, right?
Yes, I'm sure there have been.
In fact, we've had jail calls where he's made veiled threats against Mr. Haynes. Did you realize that?
There have been times when he's been very upset with things, yes.
Well, first he was upset with Mr. Schultz. You remember that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Because Mr. Schultz had a big conscience, and he was, quote, just beside himself watching the video, that son of a bitch. That was that was one of his lawyers at one time, right? Right?
Yes, sir.
And that's the phone call where he also says, and I don't know if you remember or not, that cop can go to hell. Speaking of the trooper that he shot through the leg. You remember that one?
No, I do not remember him saying that.
Then on April 20th of 2021, he refers to Mr. Haynes as a bleeding heart liberal who started out as a prosecutor and couldn't handle it. He calls him these are his words, not mine, that effing piece of shit. If we need to get a new one if he can't do what we need him to do. Do you remember that conversation?
I think so, yes.
And then right at the end, there's kind of an interesting part to it, and I don't think you caught it during the conversation. I want to see if you catch it.
Paul?
I'm going to be a model citizen, so I don't go back to jail. I'm not going to be,
I know you will.
trying to risk anything. But, if I don't...
Bryan, please be careful what you're saying.
Again, you're telling him, Bryan, be careful. Be careful of what you're saying, right? Just heard you say, be careful of what you're saying.
He doesn't want to represent me faithfully, He's kidding himself,
Okay, I
got lots of
know.
connections, and I got, a guy too I know who's a contract painter. So, labor contractors, I know a lot of them, so.
That probably didn't mean anything to you, did it? That he went from, if he's not going to represent me favorably, he's kidding himself. I've got connections. I know contract painters. I know a lot of painters. That probably didn't mean anything to you, did it?
Yes.
You never watched any mafia movies. You didn't understand contract painter is a term for a hitman. And I'm not saying he actually knows any, but you didn't realize that was a threat to his own attorney, did you?
No, sir.
You understand we're going to hear from some doctors here in a little bit, right?
Yes.
Would you would agree with me that Bryan Cahill is a very poor historian as far as the events of his life and being able to relay those events to others, right? Let me rephrase that. Do you believe that Bryan Cahill is good at being able to say true things that have happened to him, or are a lot of things the way he describes them to us just out there because of whatever, mental illness, whatever that reason is, right? He doesn't see things the way they really happened. Fair?
I don't know.
Do you remember when?
True or not?
Do you remember when he told you that his brother John raped his cat? Remember that discussion? That didn't happen, did it?
No, sir.
You remember that he told you that CIA experimented on him at Baylor? He was going to Baylor Medical, that the CIA was doing experiments on him? That didn't happen, did it?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that you're aware of. No, I mean, like, you don't believe the CIA was experimenting on Bryan Cahill at Baylor Hospital when he was going there for treatment, do you?
No, sir.
Okay. I mean, that wasn't a... Are you thinking about it, or I mean, do you really think there may be a chance?
I don't know how much I'm allowed to say.
If it's anything other than no, that probably is the answer.
Okay, well.
You think there could be a chance? Maybe possibly the CIA did.
I think not, but I would say that I have been told by some reputable professional counselors that there have been some kind of strange circumstances that have that were going on in the 1980s and early 90s. I certainly can't say that I thought they were specifically experimenting on Bryan.
Okay. And like anything else, I mean, we've got to take what Bryan tells us with a grain of salt, right?
We have to be thoughtful about what he says, yes.
I'm saying, like, when Bryan talks to you, he tells you things like, John raped his cat. He tells you things like, I was experimented on by the CIA. He tells you the CIA was at his arraignment. He tells you, I mean, like, as far as being able to, to talk about what's happened in his life, I mean, he's...
Yes, I understand.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
all right. So, anything that we're relying on, we have to be careful about if it's coming from Bryan. Fair enough?
We have to be thoughtful about it, yes.
Like I said, he's spoken with you a lot about if he gets out, he's going to come live with you, right?
He would like that, yes.
Do you remember the conversation you had with him where you sent him pictures of your new home?
I remember sending pictures, yes.
It actually ended up, so that we don't have to play it, ended up being like one call into another one, and he was screaming at you because you were arguing over whether there's a window shade or whether there were blinds in the window. You remember that?
I remember having some difficult conversations, yes.
And aside from cussing you out and aside from screaming at you, you remember him talking to you about coming, and if he was going to be living in that house, we would need to board up the windows, and he talked to you about the type of wood to get and how to nail them up and cover all those windows up. You remember that?
I do remember that one conversation. Yeah, there was one like that.
You would agree with me that in the jail calls, he's still talking about abusing alcohol, and he's still talking about not feeling safe unless he's got a gun in a home, right?
I don't remember him saying that, no.
Which part?
The last part.
The gun?
Yeah.
I don't remember him talking about whether you had a storm door or not, and then he went on to talk about some racist things, and then he said, frankly, I wouldn't feel comfortable without a gun in my home. Don't remember that?
I don't remember that specific statement now.
But regardless, if Bryan Cahill doesn't go to prison, you understand, like on probation, he's not going to a mental facility, right? It's prison or he's coming out, right? You understand that?
I'm not sure that I understand what the probation part would be. Whether he would be in a facility or not, I don't really understand that part of it.
So, and let me be clear. If he goes to TDC, based on his conditions, there are units for mental health consumers, for people where there are doctors, there are fellows, there is treatment. That exists within TDC.
Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence.
You had mentioned you wanted him to have treatment, but do you also understand that if the jury gives him probation, he's walking out the doors with them being put on probation? You understand that, right?
It's my understanding that the judge would decide what that probation would look like. What
the conditions would be, what we could say, get a job, go take your medicine, try not to get guns, but you understand probation is the opposite of being put somewhere, right?
I didn't understand that, no, but...
Well, then, understanding that, if he is given probation, he's coming to live with you, right? Or wrong?
I don't know what that requirement would be, but if that was the way that he could get treatment, then yes.
Okay. Again, he can get treatment in prison. What you're saying is you want him to be released. Either come live with you, or I guess you're going to get him another apartment, right?
I want him to receive treatment, and I don't believe that it doesn't sound to me like that's very possible in the prison system.
We allow the jury to hear from people in the prison system, they'd probably be in a better position to understand, right? But let's say he gets probation. He's got to live somewhere. He's not in prison. Is it going to? And I feel like I've asked it a couple different ways. So, is he living with you if he gets out?
Yes, if that was one of the conditions, yes.
Or are you going to get him an apartment?
No, he would be living in my home.
And you would have as much control of him as you do, as we see in those jail calls, right? You don't have to answer that one. I'll pass the witness.
No further questions. Room in 10 minutes. Clayton, and I know your firm, and it's good to see you. Yes, he is.
We get the witness to come forward, please. Have the hearing, and then that witness can testify, and then depending on where we are time-wise, I can send the jury home, and we can have the second hearing after this witness testifies. So, Lou, can you please tell the jury that their break is going to be a little bit longer than thought, so we have to have a hearing? Tell them, be back in 30 minutes? Luke, so just tell them to be back in 30 minutes. Good afternoon. Do you swear or affirm that your testimony will be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to proceed, or would you like Mr. Haynes to make an offer of proof?
Judge, if the court will allow me, I am not questioning Dr. McGarrahan's qualifications as an expert. I am simply requesting the 705 hearing. So it'd probably be quicker if I do it. That's okay with the court.
That's fine.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, let's start here, and I think this is probably how you're used to doing it. Can we start with the sources that you looked at with regards to making your opinion?
Yes, sir. I had a series of records that included mental health records and billing insurance records as it related to Mr. Cahill. That information was provided by Mrs. Cahill. It included records from Spring Lake Ranch, the Stell School, Mr. Cahill's resume, an order of protected custody, United Healthcare, and Aetna explanation of benefits, La Hacienda Treatment Center, a short timeline that Mrs. Cahill made with respect to his treatment, Baylor Richardson Medical Center, Collin County Sheriff's Office, treatment records here in the jail, Texas Behavioral Health Systems, which was outpatient mental health treatment. I had a couple of notes from Dr. John Moore, who was Mr. Cahill's ear doctor. I had the brain imaging results from January 30th, 2021. I had more recently Dr. Clem's neuropsychological report as well as his raw test data. I had a mitigation timeline that was put together by the mitigation specialist with respect to events in Mr. Cahill's life. And then I had some discovery from the incident offense. And I apologize. And I spoke with Mrs. Cahill for a couple of hours in person.
In regards to Dr. John Moore.
Yes.
May I approach, Judge?
Yes.
See what you're talking about there?
Yes, and actually, can I grab it out of my bag over there? It's all my records.
Is that okay, Judge?
Fine.
Do you mind if I walk you through some general categories and see what you know, because obviously with the discovery, that's a lot of stuff. Do you mind if I walk you through some things and ask if you see them?
Yes.
Did you look at the offense reports in this case?
Yes, I mostly have the affidavit for arrest warrants.
Okay.
So I don't know that I have every single police report.
That's okay. Did you look at the pictures?
No, sir.
What about videos? Did you watch any of the videos from the offense?
No, sir.
Did you receive or did you look through the prior police reports?
No, sir.
You've already gone over prior medical records. What about, and I believe you looked at the jail medical records as well?
Correct.
What about jail disciplinary incidents?
I would have to look, but I don't think so.
Okay. What about prior hearing transcripts?
No, sir.
Jail visitation videos?
No.
Jail call recordings?
No.
You said that you interviewed the mom.
Yes, sir.
And those are the notes you've already provided to me. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
Did you interview the defendant?
I did.
And you provided, I believe, the raw data to Dr. Clem?
Correct.
Did you discuss the offense with the defendant?
I did not.
Did you discuss medical history with the defendant?
I did.
Did you discuss drug use with the defendant?
Yes.
Did you have, I guess sum it up this way, did you interview anybody else with regards to this?
Other than Mr. Cahill and his mother, I did not.
I know that you mentioned Dr. Clem's report.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you before we talk about that report, did you review any other expert reports?
The imaging results, and I apologize, I failed to mention Dr. Lewine's neuroscientific report.
I figured that one. Did you review any documentation by a Dr. William Dunn?
I did not.
And with regards to what you reviewed from Dr. Lewine, that was I think there are actually two different reports that we got at some point in time?
Yes, sir.
With regards to Dr. Clem's report, you said you did review that? I
did, and his raw test data.
Did that change anything with regards to your opinions?
No, sir, it did not.
Did you review within Dr. Lewine's information, I guess you said the imaging, so that would have been by Dr. Travis Snyder?
The reports about the imaging, yes.
Anything about his findings change any of your opinions?
No.
Is there anything in this case that you requested that you did not receive?
Not to my recollection.
And let me couch that, because I am sure we all would have wanted more medical records and have made requests.
Yes, sir.
So I'm not faulting you for that. I'm just asking, is there anything that you're like, look, I asked for this, I should have it, and I don't?
No, sir.
If you don't mind, I'd then like to move, and we're getting really close to being done, to your testing.
Yes, sir.
Did you test the defendant for competency?
I did not.
Do you know, did someone else?
Say that again, I missed it.
Do you know if someone else has?
I don't know.
Okay. Did you test this defendant for insanity?
I did not.
Do you know, did someone else?
I don't.
Did you test this defendant with regard to intelligence?
I did.
What was your finding?
His full-scale IQ on the Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale 4th edition was a 94.
Where does that place him?
Average.
Did you test this defendant for autism?
I did administer some tests to determine if he and his mother described symptoms consistent with autism spectrum disorder or commonly referred to as Asperger's.
What was your finding?
Both Mr. Cahill and his mother provided sort of subclinical scores on the instrument. Mr. Cahill did describe some things consistent with Asperger's, which is just really social difficulties in the social realm, not being able to read interpersonal cues, not really having interest in or motivation to have interpersonal or social relationships. So some of those things were consistent with it. I'm not giving a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. There are some traits and characteristics that are consistent with it, but I think that there are some other things that may explain some of his behavior.
Did you test the defendant for personality disorders?
I did.
And what was your finding?
He had some maladaptive personality traits on psychological testing. Certainly some of his history is consistent with maladaptive personality traits. Other psychological testing was invalid, so I wasn't able to glean a lot from that.
And if I understand what you're telling me is you administered the test that you use because of the way he was answering, you weren't able to score it.
You're able to score it. The results are not interpretable because of an inconsistent pattern. So it can be invalid due to a variety of reasons. This was not because he was malingering or trying to look bad. It was more sort of either confusion or carelessness or an inability to attend and concentrate in order to answer the questions appropriately. So the test didn't really give me any specific information, but his history gives me some information.
I think that answers this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask, did you test him for psychopathy?
I did not.
All right, so then let's talk about your opinions. What opinions are you prepared to make to the court today?
I'm going to be talking about the neuropsychological evaluation that I performed with respect to Mr. Cahill, which indicated a significant decline in intellectual and cognitive abilities over the last 30 years of his life. He has pretty significant impairment in the way that he thinks about things, his ability to attend and concentrate, to make decisions, to remember information. He has indications from his records and his presentation that he suffers from severe mental illness. There are a variety of diagnoses that are probably applicable to him with respect to that. I believe he suffers from a schizophrenia spectrum disorder of some type. I believe that he has significant and severe mood instability that needs to be treated. He has long-standing and early indications of pretty severe anxiety disorder in the form of panic disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He certainly has a history of drug and alcohol abuse that are applicable. Those are the primary diagnoses with respect to him. My general opinions are going to be talking about the data, talking about prior testing. You mentioned this as prior testing, I believe, at the age of 10, that showed him to be in the superior range of intellectual functioning. Current valid testing shows a very severe decline in his cognitive abilities.
And then, finally, are you making any opinions with regard to head trauma?
Yes, in the sense that my results, the impairments, like his mental health conditions, are probably due to a variety of things. So it has multiple etiologies for the impairment and the deficiencies that we're seeing on testing. from chronic mental illness, which tends to have a negative effect on brain functioning, to his longstanding and pretty extensive drug abuse and alcohol abuse. There were a number of reported head injuries that could be consistent with some of the findings as well. So in that regard, I will be talking about my results being consistent with a variety of things, including potential head trauma.
Do you have are you going to be making an opinion as to which of the etiologies you see as the most significant contributor, or rate them in any way?
I'm not able to do that. I just don't have the science to do that.
Okay. I mean, and that's universal. That's not just you.
Well, that's from my standpoint, from neuropsychological test results. That might be different from the imaging perspective and what have you, but from the results that we have, there's a lot of things contributing, and I'm not able to say what percentage each are contributing. Are you going to give an opinion with regards to an explanation for the offense? I don't think so. I mean, I don't plan to. I don't know if there are going to be questions about whether these conditions were present at the time, in which case my opinion would be yes, these conditions would be present. I did not go into great detail, as Mr. Cahill didn't want to talk about the offense specifically. We talked some about his functioning in the months leading up. I think it's similar to what Dr. Clem was able to talk to him about. But I'm not going to be providing an opinion on a specific mental state at the time of the offenses.
I guess I don't get to come back and do this again. I guess what I'm saying is, are you in any way going to rate, the findings from your eval included schizoaffective, severe mental illness, mood instability, drug and alcohol abuse, if we include the head trauma in there, are you going to are you able to in any way rate those with regards to, I think this is what we saw on that day more than something else?
No, sir.
Okay. And then finally, do you have an opinion with regards to, or did you create a treatment plan for Bryan Cahill?
I did not.
Okay. Did you do a risk assessment on Bryan Cahill?
I did not.
And I'm being told I may have not made this clear enough. Did you diagnose any personality disorders?
I didn't have a list of diagnoses. I would say that Mr. Cahill does have, he probably would meet criteria for sort of an unspecified personality disorder with different types of traits, primarily paranoid and some narcissistic and some antisocial.
And this is going to sound like, but I think what I'm hearing is it sounds like you and Dr. Clem found a lot of the same stuff.
Pretty much so, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Doctor. Judge, I have no objections to any of this testimony.
All right. Bring in the jury. we don't have all the jurors in the jury room, so let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Friday. Thursday. in a jury. All right. Please be seated. Mr. Haynes, please call your next witness.
Defense calls Dr. Antoinette McGarrahan.
This witness has been sworn.
Read.
You may.
What's your name, please, ma'am?
Antoinette McGarrahan.
And we've already called you doctor, so how so are you a doctor?
I have a PhD in clinical psychology from UT Southwestern Medical Center.
Briefly describe the qualifications you have that allows you to perform that work.
So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in psychology with a specialization in neuropsychology. I have my doctorate in clinical psychology. I then went on to do a one-year postdoctoral training fellowship in forensic psychology at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I returned back to Texas and have been licensed to practice as a psychologist since 2000.
All right, so the whole process of your education took how many years?
20.
All right, and now you have been working in the field for 21 years.
Correct.
All right, so what is the nature of your work?
As a psychologist, my areas of specialty are forensic psychology and neuropsychology, and so that means that I'm mostly conducting psychological evaluations and cognitive evaluations of individuals who are involved in the justice system. That can be in the criminal justice system like we are here today, or in the civil arena, or immigration courts, or any type of court.
So mostly you are explaining the science you work in to tribunals that have to make decisions about people, right?
Yes, sir.
You are not treating people in your office who are ill and need help.
That's correct.
Right. The two fields interface, but they're quite different, right?
Yes, sir, they are.
Right. So you were asked, in this case, to evaluate Mr. Cahill, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was the purpose of the evaluation that you were asked to do?
The purpose was to conduct a neuropsychological evaluation of Mr. Cahill, and that involves looking at his brain functioning as well as his emotional status and personality characteristics.
So let's make sure we define our terms. When we say psychological, that's related to psychiatry, but the two things are different, right?
Correct.
So what's the difference between psychology and psychiatry?
Psychology is the study of human behavior, and psychologists typically get a doctorate, either a PhD or a PsyD, PSYD, or even an EdD, an educational doctorate. And psychologists do not prescribe medication. We're typically the ones that are doing therapy, talk therapy with people. We also conduct a lot of testing as data points for our examinations. Psychiatrists get an MD, they go to medical school, and then following that they specialize in psychiatry, and they mostly prescribe medication, although some psychiatrists still do therapy, but they don't do the degree of testing and reliance upon data that psychologists typically do.
So they're approaching the study of the human mind, but kind of from two different directions. Here?
It's sort of the same direction, but maybe just different components of that same direction.
All right. So in order to do your work, you gather information about a person's past, right?
Correct.
And so how do you do that?
In a variety of ways. We request and review medical records, mental health records, educational records, lots of document review, and then we sometimes conduct collateral interviews with individuals who might have relevant information about the person that you're evaluating. And
also, you do testing, right?
Correct.
Now, what kind of testing is it? Is it like with a pencil and paper? Is it like on a computer? Is it like moving little blocks? Tell me how it works.
All of the above. So we have paper and pencil tests that we administer. Some are computerized. Some are little blocks or sorting pictures or sorting cards. And it usually involves a lot of cognitive data like IQ, testing for memory, testing for attention and concentration, somebody's language abilities, and then your standard personality tests that give you information about severe mental illness as well as personality disorders. So we're going to come back and talk about testing in a minute. Let's talk first about what you looked at concerning Mr. Cahill. What did you look at? I looked at quite a bit of prior mental health records from places and school records from places like the Stell School, Spring Lake Ranch, United Healthcare, La Hacienda Treatment Center, Baylor Richardson, Texas Behavioral Health Systems. I reviewed his medication records from the jail here. I also reviewed records from an ear doctor, Dr. Moore, and then there were some brain imaging results, as well as a neuroscience report and another neuropsychological evaluation that I reviewed.
Right. And police reports in this case are like thousands of pages. You didn't look at all those reports, did you?
Correct. I looked at a small portion of the records that described what happened at the time of the offense.
The summary that you read gave you a full picture of what happened at the apartments when the whole mess happened. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Now, also, similarly, there have been a lot of video that was taken. You didn't look at any of the video, is that correct?
Correct. I didn't review the video.
The report describes what the video shows.
Correct. Yes.
All right. Now let's turn to the testing. How many different tests did you use?
I mean, it's upwards of 30 tests or more.
Right. And so sit here and describe every single test that you administered. That would take us the rest of the afternoon, right?
Yes, and it'd be very, very boring.
All right.
Yes.
And so what is a psychologist trying to accomplish with administering so many tests as that to a person?
This was specifically a neuropsychological evaluation, so it's more extensive than just a regular psychological evaluation. The goals are to evaluate and determine the individual's brain functioning, so how the brain is doing with respect to your ability to think and remember and make decisions and concentrate. And so the tests give us information as to how all the different parts of the brain are doing and functioning.
So each test is formulated by a person who's in the same business as you, right?
Essentially, yes. Yes.
And each test is then, it's a copyrighted test, right?
Correct.
I can't just go say, hey, let me have this test and I want to take it and see how I look. I can't do that, can I?
Right. You have to have qualifications to be able to purchase and administer and interpret the test.
Because every time you administer the test, you have to buy it, right?
Yes, for the most part.
I mean, you can't buy it once and then use the same test on 50 people. Each time you use the test, it has to be purchased.
It's the same test. Sometimes the forms and the responses are an additional purchase, but the test is typically the same that you administer to everybody.
So, administer the test, the person answers the test, and then you have to score the test, right?
Correct.
And how do you do that? How do you score it?
Some are by hand scoring, looking at the manual, and others are computer scored, entering information into a database that gives you the results.
And how do you learn then from, so you've got one test and one result, how do you learn what that means?
The tests that we administer are standardized, so they're given the same way to everybody that is given them. And then we have norms or normative data where we have large numbers of individuals who have taken that test from a variety of different age groups and educational backgrounds. And then we compare the person that we evaluated to one of their peers. So for Mr. Cahill, I would compare him to other individuals of his age and his educational background, as well as other males. So we're comparing sort of apples to apples and how a person at that age with that educational background should perform. And that gives us information then with respect to how Mr. Cahill or the person you're evaluating performs.
So more people who take the test over time, the larger the database becomes, right?
Not everybody that we evaluate goes into the normative database. So the norms are there prior to the test being administered for clinical purposes. They make sure they do the research so it's valid, they're reliable, and they give us good information. So then Mr. Cahill's data does not go into a normative base. I just use that normative base to compare how he's doing.
Basically, you're looking at his results and you compare it to the whole universe of results obtained from people who are kind of in his same general.
Correct.
And with that, you're able to make conclusions based on your education and training.
Correct, yes.
So, let's talk about when we say a cognitive test, what do we mean by that?
A cognitive test is one that looks at how your brain is functioning. So we have IQ tests, we have tests of memory and attention and concentration, as well as decision-making, problem-solving, planning, language. So somebody's ability to think about things. All right,
so you mentioned IQ, so let's talk about that a little bit. You tested him for IQ when you met with him, is that correct?
That's correct.
This was when?
I met with him on 4 occasions. The cognitive testing occurred in September of 2020.
You also had some records that showed the result of a previous IQ test, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so, first of all, for the benefit of the jury, what is an IQ test?
It's a test that we administer to individuals to determine their global functioning of their brain based on a variety of different sort of subcategories or skills that the psychological or mental health community says sort of makes up our broad intellect.
So generally, the higher the IQ score, the greater a person's intellect.
Correct.
Right. So did you have a result from a historical result from in Mr. Cahill's past about a previous time before your examination when his IQ was measured?
Yes.
And what was that, and when did it come from?
It was when he was in the 5th grade at the Stell School, and his full scale or his broad IQ was 129.
So what does that number mean? What does that tell you?
That falls in the superior range. 1 or 2 more points would put him at the very superior range with respect to intellectual functioning, at least at that time when he was tested.
Right. Tested him in 2020. What did you find?
His full-scale IQ was 94.
So significantly lower.
Yes, substantially.
Is 94 in the superior range?
No, it's in the average range.
So if a person took the IQ test once a year, every year for 20 years, would we expect them to get the same result every time? Pretty close.
I mean, the IQ is considered to be fairly stable unless something happens that causes the brain to be impaired. But generally speaking, IQ remains fairly stable throughout our lifespan.
So what does it mean if you find that a person has a 129 score in the 5th grade and then later in his 40s has a 94 score? What does that tell us?
It tells us that there has been a substantial decline in his cognitive functioning, that there's something very serious going on with his brain functioning that caused him to drop 30 points essentially, or more, which is a massive drop.
So there are other ways to look at a person's intellect other than by testing IQ, right?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, for instance, if a person had a 129 IQ, you would expect them to be very good in school, right?
Typically, yes.
And if you would look at their school results, you could compare the IQ to the school results and see if those two things were in line with each other.
Correct.
Did you have some school records with regard to Mr. Cahill?
Yes. So in addition to the IQ testing, we had academic testing, and so that lets us know how he is doing with his academic skills. Usually they're in line with each other, but sometimes when you get a learning disability, that skill is much lower than your IQ.
And so how did his academic results line up with his IQ score?
At the earlier age?
Yes.
They lined up well. He was doing very well academically. He was either at his level, his grade level, or above with respect to his academic functioning.
And does the testing that you did in April of 2020 look at that again, or no?
I did not look at the academic skills other than his ability to understand written information, just to make sure he could read the personality test that I was going to administer.
All right. So you mentioned that you saw him 4 different times. Did I get that right?
Yes.
So I understand that, I don't know, 31 tests seems like a lot of tests to me. I don't know if I would want to sit through 30 tests. First of all, is that the typical number that you administer when you do an examination like this?
Yes, it's a typical, usually 30 tests or so from a neuropsychological standpoint, yes.
And are you usually able to get through that in one session?
I usually break it up into 2.
All right, but this time you did 4 sessions.
The earlier sessions were more interview and establishing rapport with Mr. Cahill, just to make sure he was in a position he's very paranoid, so to make sure he was in a position to cooperate and engage with the testing. We also had the issue of COVID, which didn't allow me to have a face-to-face contact with him, which I have to do the testing.
Was there anything about his condition which made it necessary to do more sessions than would have otherwise been the case?
Yes, he became easily cognitively overloaded and basically sort of mentally shut down. He had substantial difficulty with the tests. They're quite challenging, and he struggled to sort of maintain his ability to kind of keep persisting.
So he had a harder time with the test than many of the other people that you test?
For the most part, unless they're as impaired as he is, but for the most part, yes.
So we're not going to go through all 31 tests, but kind of highlight for me and for the members of the jury what you thought the most important tests that you did in this case were.
The most important things were, as we mentioned, the huge drop in IQ points, which was very notable. The other areas where Mr. Cahill had substantial difficulty were in some areas of decision-making and problem-solving and planning, being able to think through things, think about the consequences of his actions, as well as his memory. His memory was quite poor, and those were the areas where he struggled the most.
So, at the end of your interviews, review of records, and the 31 tests you gave, look at everything that you had gathered together?
I did.
And did you think, okay, based on this, I think we need to do something else?
Yes.
Something more?
Yes.
And what did you think needed to be done in addition to what you had already been?
Given the results that I had, I felt that brain imaging, looking at pictures of the brain, would be important to maybe help determine the cause of the severe impairments that I was seeing, because you don't typically see that significant of an IQ drop unless there's something going on with the brain.
So brain imaging, that means looking at the inside of a person's skull to see the brain, right?
Correct.
And that's pretty new, isn't it?
In the scheme of things, yes, it's relatively new, particularly MRI imaging.
I mean, if you go back 50 years, there wasn't brain imaging, was there?
We had X-rays, probably, and CT scans, but it's become much more sophisticated over the last 50 years.
All right. So when we're imaging a brain, and imaging just means taking a picture of it, right?
Correct.
We can do a structural image or a functional image, right?
Correct.
What's the difference?
The structural is basically taking a picture of the brain and looking at whether all the parts are there. The functional imaging is going to look at how the brain is performing and doing.
So the structural image will allow us to see, is everything present? Is there any area that's damaged? Is there any area that looks different from what we expect it to look like? That's what the structural imaging is going to do for us, right?
Correct.
Whereas the functional image is, he asked me to write a letter to my mother, and we see which part of my brain is active when I do that.
Essentially, yes.
And so what you asked for was a structural image.
I think I had just referred to imaging, so whether the people doing the imaging felt that structural and or functional, I was going to let them make that determination as to how they would determine what was going on with his brain.
And what you were looking for was just to see what the image of his brain looked like, to see if there was anything in there that was significant.
That would explain what I was seeing on testing.
Now, you didn't do the imaging.
Correct.
But the imaging was done at your suggestion, and you looked at the result of it, right?
Yes.
And it took a while after your examination in April of 2020 to get that done, because it's a complicated process.
That's correct.
So, and then you looked at the images that were obtained.
I looked at the report.
And the report did contain some of the images, or did it not?
I think they're pictures of the actual images themselves, yes.
And so based on everything that you did in the case, where you looked at the records, you talked to people who could inform you about his history, you gave him the tests, you asked for the images and got them, and report about that, what did you conclude?
Mr. Cahill does have significant damage to his brain in a variety of types. I think the etiology or the cause is still not very clear. Going back to Mr. Cahill's young childhood, his condition has been difficult for professionals to determine exactly what is going on. There are multiple things, I think, that are going on. But from my examination, it's clear that his brain does not look the way it's supposed to, and it certainly is not functioning the way it's supposed to, and that a significant decline happened at some point after this testing when he was 10 years old in the 5th grade. And there were a lot of intervening factors after that, including several head injuries that he had had. Severe mental illness can and does cause, especially if it goes on for a long time, it causes damage to the brain. Some of the treatments, the medications that are used can cause some difficulties. Mr. Cahill, I think, came to this world with some vulnerabilities, genetic vulnerabilities to mental illness and mental health problems. And so it was my conclusion that he does have damage to his brain and that it's not functioning the way that it's supposed to or the way that it used to. And I think, we typically will give a diagnosis, and that's helpful in looking at the nature. I think he probably meets criteria for several mental health diagnoses. One is a schizophrenia spectrum illness, which has to do with his paranoia and his delusions, his persecutory thoughts. And I think there's some history of hallucinations as well, going back several years. He has long suffered from an anxiety disorder that impaired him severely in his ability to function day to day. So he had obsessive compulsive disorder. He also had panic disorder. I think there are some elements of an Asperger's spectrum disorder. Whether he fully meets that criteria is not clear, but there certainly are some elements there. Mr. Cahill, and one thing I failed to mention was his chronic drug abuse, which could obviously have and does have a negative effect on the brain. So he's had alcohol dependence as well as pretty significant drug abuse. And so I think all of those things kind of work together to contribute to the damage to his brain as well as to the complexity of what to call his mental illness.
Is there a physical damage? You're describing a mental illness, and the process of the mental illness can damage a physical damage to the brain as well.
Yes, it's all physical damage. When somebody has severe mental illness for many, many years, that physically damages the brain. So it's all physical is what I'm referring to. Correct.
So, when we're trying to suss out
yes,
even the most experienced, best-trained professionals are not able to be as certain about how to fix the mind as they are how to fix a broken.
I think they're getting better. I think with technology and looking at DNA and focusing treatment specific to certain DNA, they're getting better.
Still got an awful long way.
Yes, sir.
For a person like Mr. Cahill, what effect do the conditions which you observe have on his ability to function in the world and make decisions about what to do, live like we all have to try to live?
They're significantly impairing his ability to function independently, to take care of himself, to think, to be rational, to make decisions, to remember information. It's pretty substantial, the deficits that we're seeing on testing, that it's going to affect him quite substantially.
For the rest of his life?
Yes.
What prospect, if any prospect, for treatment and improvement over time? His prognosis is probably quite guarded. The damage to the brain is already there. You can't reverse that. But certainly with talk therapy and medication and certain behavioral programs, you can do the best you can. It's not going to fix things, but it'll treat some of the symptoms. Over time, that has to be continued on a consistent basis, right?
Yes.
And it has to be monitored because the type of treatment that you decide on and start today might not work consistently over time. Is that true?
That's true.
And so you can't just say, okay, here's the list of medicine you're going to take, go get a 10-year supply of it and see you later. You're going to have to be seen regularly, monitored regularly to see how the treatment is going to work. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And, know how well it's going to do, you're just going to have to do it and see how well it's going to do. There's no way to be super predictive about it.
Right. He's done better on certain regimens than others, so that's helpful to know for the treating professionals, but you have to remain vigilant because some of the medications tend to wear off.
Or to reach the point where they have diminishing effects over time.
Right.
All right. Now, again, you are not a person who is here to say this is what the treatment should be.
Correct.
You're here to give the jury information from which they have to make the judgment that they have to make in this case.
That's correct.
So, has he had personal control over every aspect of the conditions from which he now suffers?
No. I mean, the drug abuse is probably one that he's had control over, but the others are beyond his control.
And some of them may have been present since birth. You mentioned...
Yes.
All of that ought to be taken into account.
Right, that's information that they'll have to consider.
Is there anything else that kind of sums up in a nutshell what your findings are?
I think we've talked about most things. It's hard to sum up in a nutshell. There's a lot going on. It's hard to simplify it.
Okay. Give us a final summary.
Essentially, Mr. Cahill suffers from several mental health conditions. It's severe mental illness. He also has engaged in substantial drug and alcohol abuse, which has probably contributed to some of his cognitive problems. He has, he has physical issues like obesity and hypertension that also can cause some damage to the brain. But he has essentially suffered from pretty severe mental illness and cognitive problems for some time. And I think there are a variety of things that are contributing to his current condition.
So, last question. The prosecutor had another doctor take a look at Cahill, is that correct?
Yes.
And that was Dr. Clem.
Correct.
You know Dr. Clem.
I do.
And the two of you shared your test results, right?
Yes.
And did you actually speak to each other or just...
No, we just exchanged data.
All right.
Correct.
And you yourself in any agreement with Dr. Clem's?
I don't. We have pretty highly similar results. Good afternoon.
And Dr. McGarrahan, just so the jury doesn't have some expectations, in a lot of the cases where you and I have dealt with each other, that's exactly the way it turns out, right? You do your evaluation. We have our expert. Just so the jury doesn't, we're not hiding. Dr. Clem's sitting right here. You know Dr. Clem and Dr. Proctor.
Yes, sir.
And a lot of times in these types of cases, hopefully the jury isn't expecting me to start yelling at you because we do find some of the same things, right?
Correct.
Okay. You and I have worked on death penalty use together. You were on Kenneth Wayne Thomas.
Yes, sir.
Right? You probably don't remember me. I remember you.
Yes.
But in Kenneth Wayne Thomas, that was one where we had someone with head injuries. I believe you testified a sub-average IQ.
Correct.
And the jury in that case, in a death penalty case, decides whether someone spends the rest of their life in prison without parole or they get the death penalty.
Yes, sir. Yes. Okay.
And so your testimony, I'm sure we're going to see from Dr. Lewin here at some point and all that. That's, when we start talking about his fault or not his fault, that's pretty big stuff when you're talking about whether someone's life should be taken or not, right?
Correct.
I think you were on Brandon McCall here in Collin. I don't think you testified, but weren't you a doctor on that case?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that was a individual who had shot and killed a police officer in Richardson?
Yes.
Okay. You were on Byron James Shepard in Oklahoma most recently?
Yes.
You testified about his childhood, his alcohol and drug use at an early age, and trouble holding down a job?
Yes, sir.
He also had neurocognitive disorder, right?
Yes.
Problems planning and problem-solving issues?
Yes.
And he shot and killed a police officer?
Yes.
And in those death penalty cases, like I said, we're going to get to a lot of the findings here in a second, but so the jury kind of understands, in a death penalty case, when you come and testify in a punishment phase to a jury, that jury's not deciding when that person gets put in their neighborhood, right?
Correct.
They're not deciding whether or not that person's put in one of their loved ones' apartment complexes, right?
Right.
That jury's deciding, does that person live in prison for the rest of their life, or does the state take their life?
Correct.
So it's not that person's already moved from society when they're found guilty.
Correct.
And you understand this jury's job is different, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So when we start talking about whose fault it is, and so, you can see that's kind of different in one of those cases than this one, probably.
And I'm not sure what you're referring to when you say whose fault it is.
Well, you got asked by the defense counsel, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, and you read Dr. Lewins's report, right?
I did.
You saw the end of it where he put in there about how, outside of his control and put some of that type of language, right?
Well, there are some things, the development of mental illness are outside people's control.
Okay. Treating your hypertension, is that out of your control?
Having the hypertension may be somewhat out of your control, may be responsive to diet and sort of thing, and how well you follow the recommendations are within your control.
Right. Taking your medicine.
Correct.
Eating the right diet.
Yes.
When a doctor tells you your blood pressure is so bad that you need to even go and take your Clonidine, refusing that's in your control.
Correct.
Deciding to take LSD, that's in your control.
Yes.
PCP, that's in your control.
Yes.
Marijuana's in your control.
Yes.
I think he told you methamphetamine too, right?
I believe so, yes.
And the jury hasn't heard any of this part yet, though, right? He told you, Bryan Cahill, I've taken LSD, PCP, methamphetamine. And tell me if I'm right or not, was there heroin with you or was that with Dr. Clem?
Let me look.
Okay.
He said heroin with me.
Okay. All right. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. I get it. Some things are out of somebody's control. Some things are within somebody's control. Us parsing that in and out when we're talking about who he is today is what I'm saying may or may not be as important to this jury as it is to a death penalty jury. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about Bryan Cahill. Will you please hand me a copy of your report or hand the jury a copy of your report so we can start looking at it?
I don't have a written report.
You don't have a written report?
No, I don't have a written report.
You got to see Dr. Clem's written report?
I did.
Okay. If you were brought into this courtroom by Judge Smith to do a competency on this defendant, you would provide him with a report, correct?
Correct. When it's court ordered, then you do.
And if you were asked by this court to evaluate Bryan Cahill for insanity, you would write a report and deliver it to the court, right?
If I was asked by the court to do it, yes.
And and you would expect to get paid too, right?
Of course.
Of course. I mean, so does Dr. Clem, right?
Right.
But you didn't do a report in this case.
No, it's not required when the defense retains you.
I understand it's not required, and you would agree with me. Well, I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but will you tell the jury what the American Psychological Association is?
Yes, it's a organization for psychologists, professional organization to which many psychologists belong. And
what are the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology?
They are guidelines or aspirations for individuals who are psychologists who do forensic type work.
And they kind of set guidelines for how, within this industry, we want to do our work. We want to make sure that things are done the way they need to be done so that we keep our profession at the highest levels.
Yes, mostly.
And part of that is just, at very beginning, 1.01, 1.02, it's talking about we don't want to show bias and we don't want to have impartiality.
Correct.
Okay. Why did you not write a report in this one? And I understand it's not required. I'm saying, why did you not write one in this one?
Because I'm here to provide testimony. Usually it comes in the form of testimony or a written report. They're not both required. So I'm here. I provided the data to Dr. Clem for him to review.
Were you asked not to write a report?
No. Essentially it was provide your testimony here. It wasn't specific to don't write a report.
And tell the jury, because you've done enough 705 hearings, right? You've done 705, 702 hearings on all these cases, hundreds of cases you testified to, right?
There's not always a 702 or 705.
Before that, I'm not entitled to your report, right?
Correct.
And when you don't write a report, like in this case, you got to see Dr. Clem's report, got to look at it, got to evaluate it, got to talk to Mr. Haynes about it, got to strategize, right?
Because of the rules that allowed that, correct.
Okay. And the defense in this case, and I'm not saying it's your decision, but the defense in this case decided you're not going to write a report, and therefore we couldn't do those things, right? I mean, it's a good strategy if you use it.
I don't know what their strategy was. They asked me to testify and provide the results in live testimony.
In your work, in all the opinions we talked about, or that you've given, you have to rely on data from sources. You talked about the sources in this case, right?
Yes.
Okay. Mainly it's in the form of records and interviews.
Yes.
You read the affidavits, and the affidavits are for the jury, kind of a summation of all the evidence. So you were able to see what police believed Bryan Cahill did that night.
Correct.
You did not watch videos from the offense.
Correct.
You said you looked at the past medical records. You'd agree with me that because they're so old, there wasn't much.
There wasn't a whole lot, correct.
You did not look at his jail disciplinary incidents.
Not that I recall.
Would it have helped you to know how he was acting in jail on his current medication?
I had good indication of spending 8 hours with him, how he was acting.
Okay. Did you watch him interact with guards and jailers?
Some, yes.
Was he cussing them out?
Potentially, yes. I don't remember especially, but he was paranoid and agitated and angry.
What about female staff?
I didn't see any of those interactions.
Would it have helped you to have read about his interactions and what he calls the nurses over there?
Not really with respect to diagnoses, no.
Did you watch jail visitation videos or jail calls with his mom?
I didn't.
And I am really actually asking you, would it have helped to have seen how he treats his mom, how he acts, how he talks?
I think it's pretty clear. I think there was a lot of information as to how that happened, yes, and how he treated her.
The videos of him actually committing the offense and his actions that night, would that have helped you?
Not from a diagnostic standpoint, no.
If you're telling the jury that he has trouble making decisions, if he has trouble, part of the testing on executive function, you're changing the rules in the middle of the test, and when someone doesn't perform well, that tells you they have trouble with decision making when the game's starting to change, right?
Sure.
That's part of it. It's one of the tests.
Yes.
Would it have helped you to have seen whether we had somebody that night when he shot a trooper, whether he's doing circles before he enters a gate because otherwise he's going to get pinned, or that he's recognizing a tactical disadvantage between firing points? If he's making good decisions amongst gunfire, would that have helped?
Not necessarily. I'm not disputing any of those things that happened.
Well, then, without reviewing that stuff, then you rely on interviews, right?
And I relied on an interview with his mother. Yes.
Yes. An interview with his mother, and tell the jury what is the big issue with historians. What happens if you have a poor historian?
Right, you don't get accurate information.
If you start with a poor historian, it's kind of like, I'm going to forget the phrase, and I've seen it whenever y'all testify. It's, what is it?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage in, garbage out. Thank you, doctor. I'm having some executive function issues. But if you're listening to a poor historian, and the poor historian gives you facts that aren't good facts, then that hurts your ability to really be able to say, hey, this is what my findings are. Right? Well,
you take it with a grain of salt. I mean, there's an understanding that there's, the mother of the defendant, and you want to corroborate information that you're given from her as well as from the defendant. It's a piece of information. Do you take it as fact all the time? No.
And in fact, that's also in your guidelines, right? You're supposed to search for corroborative evidence. Is that right?
Yes.
You want to make sure that when rely upon data that have not been corroborative, forensic practitioners seek to make known the uncorroborative status, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to get to your other results in a second because, like you said, we don't dispute a lot of your results. The one I want to kind of talk about for a second, though, is head trauma.
Okay.
All right? And you'd agree with me that's the world we live in right now. Head trauma is the big thing. TBIs are the big thing in litigation, right?
Yes, they can be.
It's the popular science right now, especially in the death penalty and the TBI civil world.
But it's real science. I mean, there's real science out there that's being done, particularly at UT Southwestern, that looks at head trauma, and some of this stuff is new. So just by the fact that it's popular doesn't mean it's not real.
Absolutely. No question at all. And in fact, radiologists and neuroradiologists use imaging on a regular basis to treat people, to diagnose people, and to hopefully be able to make them right. Right?
Yes.
Okay. But you would also agree with me that just like anything else, we've got to be careful about what we buy into and not. We've got to look at it. We've got to weigh it, right?
Of course.
So with regards to any discussions about brain injury, so let's start with Christine Cahill. Good historian or poor historian?
I don't think you can characterize it one or the other. She provided a lot of helpful information. Some of it was borne out in the records that I had, and other stuff I didn't necessarily find corroborating.
Was a lot of her information from her son?
What do you mean from her son?
Well, let's take a motorcycle accident, for example. If she told you he was on a motorcycle accident that she didn't see, would that have been from her son?
Well, that would have been, yes, but I was mainly looking to get information from her about his developmental history, the things that she noticed, the problems he had.
Sure. And again, we're going to get to those in a second, but if we could, let's just talk about head trauma stuff right now, okay? I got mental illness. He's got we got it. So the fence post incident, right?
Right.
It's one of the ones you used.
I don't know what you mean by used.
Okay.
Did I gather the information? Yes.
Let me back up then. Do you remember when Mr. Haynes was asking you questions?
Yes.
Do you remember when you told Mr. Haynes that one of the etiologies could be head trauma?
Could be, yes.
Okay. I want to talk to you about the sources of information that led you to make that statement to Mr. Haynes.
Okay.
Okay. Starting with Mom. Was the fence post something you considered? He got hit in the head with a fence post. It
was information I considered, yes.
The motorcycle accident, was that something you considered?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I mean, you were in here for her testimony, right? You heard her and I talking about it? I heard cross-examination. I wasn't in here for direct. Okay. Well, but you heard her and I talking about it, right?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that those two incidents, as she described, would be at best mild traumatic brain injury, at best.
I don't recall how she described them. It was mainly you asking questions as to whether she knew about it or not. I don't know that I had a good description as to what happened.
Okay. So let's do this then. Let's talk about mild traumatic brain injury. If someone suffers from a mild traumatic brain injury, correct?
Yes.
What that means is they've had maybe a possible moment of loss of consciousness that's not extended for very long, right? It's not like a coma.
Could be.
Okay. And then, and when someone suffers one of those, if there's brain injury, we're going to see that resolve itself over a week to month period, as opposed to more severe traumatic brain injuries, right? You
don't typically see concussion resolve in a week to a month. It's usually 3 to 6 months, if maybe a little bit longer.
Okay, 3 to 6 months. Right, okay. You heard her say, we follow the concussion, look for signs of a concussion, didn't see anything, never took him to a hospital, right?
Right.
So then those were the two you got from her, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, everything else would have been from Bryan, right? Those were the only two things she told you. I'm sorry. Did you consider the head banging as a child?
Sure, it's something you consider. Do I think it caused head trauma? Probably not, but it's something that you consider with respect to mental health problems from a very early age.
Again, we'll get to mental health in a second. You're not looking at that as far as head trauma.
You can't separate these things out as though they're occurring in a vacuum. All this stuff is occurring together, so it's not like you can just say, head trauma here, we're not going to talk about that. We don't have the science to say, his brain is damaged because of this specific thing.
Right, and we're going to get to that too. what about him telling you that his father strangled and headbutted him as a child?
What about it?
Did you consider that?
I considered all the information he provided me, of course.
And that's what I'm asking for. So, I mean, you've told the jury that part of one of the things that you're considering with regards to his damaged brain is brain injury from head trauma.
Correct.
I'm asking you, if Bryan Cahill told you that his dad strangled him and headbutted him, you're going to consider that in telling them part of what they should be thinking about with his brain is that it had head trauma.
No, I think I'm indicating that's one thing that I considered with respect to his entire functioning. It's not that you rule in or rule out any specific injury as occurring or not occurring. You take all of that information together and provide that to the jury for them to make their decision.
Did you have medical records of mental illness, I mean, just from the things you saw?
Of mental illness?
Yes.
Yes.
Did you have school records of IQ decline? I mean, from your testing to prior school records?
I had prior IQ testing, yes.
Do you have any medical records on head trauma?
I did not.
Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
No.
Okay. Bryan Cahill, you haven't listened to his jail calls, right?
Correct.
Okay, so you don't know that Bryan Cahill has accused his brother of raping a cat.
I heard that, and I may have seen that somewhere else.
Did you consider Bryan Cahill a good historian when deciding whether or not to use what he's telling you, in your opinion?
Again, I considered the information he provided me. Not all of it was accurate.
Did you know that Bryan Cahill gave even more head trauma information to Dr. Clem when Dr. Clem interviewed him?
I saw that, yes.
I mean, he embellished the stuff he told you, right?
I don't know if it's embellishment. I can't opine on that.
Okay. You know that he also was very difficult for Dr. Clem to deal with because he knew that Dr. Clem was on our side, was representing the state.
Again, is that why he was not cooperative? I don't know the reason. I don't know Mr. Cahill's reasoning. But yes, he was very difficult. He was difficult with me as well. Did you
find when you interviewed him that he wanted to stay away from discussing mental illness and really wanted to focus on head injuries and drug use?
Not really, no.
All right. So there's no corroborative medical records of TBIs.
Correct.
And all of the evidence of TBIs that you have based your opinions on are coming from Christine Cahill and Bryan Cahill.
I don't think they're evidence of TBIs. I think it's information that I've considered.
All of the information that you considered on head trauma was from Christine Cahill and Bryan Cahill?
Yes.
And you are not willing to say whether those are good historians or bad historians?
I can't characterize it as one or the other.
Who did you talk to corroborate what Christine or Bryan Cahill told you?
I reviewed records, and some of it was corroborated and some wasn't.
With regards to head injuries?
Oh, nobody.
Let's talk a little bit about the deficits you did see. Well, first let's talk about IQ. His IQ was at 129 in 5th grade?
Yes.
It's at 94 now?
Yes.
You said generally your IQ is going to stay stable barring some type of event or some type of disease or whatever that is. It should stay stable, right?
Relatively, yes.
Do we know, I mean, you've got the 2 points. Do we know when the decline occurred?
No.
Do we know why the decline occurred?
No.
Is it just as likely that if someone decided after 5th grade to start using LSD and heroin and PCP that we're going to see a decline in IQ?
You're not typically going to see a 30-point drop, but yes, you can see some significant damage as a result of drug use.
Oh, and I forgot, DXM. Did he talk to you about DXM abuse?
Yes.
Okay. DXM, is found in cough suppressants. If taken in the right dosages, it has the same effects as PCP and ketamine as far as a hallucinogen, right?
Right.
If we have Bryan Cahill, now let's go. 5th grade, 129. Over the next however long before you test him, LSD, PCP, heroin, heavy alcohol abuse, a couple things we haven't talked about. Smoker, right?
Right.
And then DXM for years, according to him. You would expect to see, maybe not account for it all, because just like you said, you can't label this is the one or this is the one, but you would expect that to lead to a decline in IQ.
Not necessarily. I mean, it could, but it doesn't have to.
So people can use LSD, meth, heroin, PCP as much as they want, and we won't see a decline in IQ.
That happens. I see it regularly.
Okay. No question that we see mental illness, and we're going to go into some of those for a second. But it sounds to me like you're saying really the two biggest things are deficits that you see are memory and executive functioning. Right?
Yes.
We see that not only with the offense. That was some pretty poor decision making. But like what you're letting the jury know is like this is real stuff. His brain is damaged, and it shows up in the test that I gave.
Yes.
But like you said, you can't tell the jury this is why we see the damage to the brain, right?
Correct.
Okay. If someone does not treat their hypertension, we would expect to see brain bleeds.
You could.
Right, because when someone doesn't treat their hypertension, we talk about strokes, right?
Correct.
Right, so you would expect to see damage in the brain if you don't deal with it.
You could, yes. If you saw it, it would be consistent with that. Not everybody with hypertension has those abnormalities on imaging.
And just like not everybody with TBIs have abnormality on imaging.
Correct, absolutely.
And the whole point is no one can look at that imaging and say, this is because of hypertension or this is because of traumatic brain injury, right?
I'm not interpreting the imaging, but that's correct. You can't assign a specific thing.
Oh, and while we're here, so I don't have to go, the only people who are qualified to look at imaging and then interpret them are going to be radiologists and neuroradiologists, right?
To interpret the images themselves.
Yes.
Yes.
People go to medical school and then do residency in radiology so that they can look at imaging and interpret them and diagnose from them.
Yes, the neuroscientists work with them as well. Doctoral level neuroscientists work with the images and closely with the neuroimaging folks.
Can I go to a neuroscientist, have them look at my imaging, and then diagnose me?
No.
Because that would be practicing medicine, right?
Correct.
Okay, and I get it. We're going to hear from Dr. Lewin, and he's a neuroscientist, and he's going to talk about images. But the truth of it is, for us to go to someone who can look at those images and tell us, this is what I see in the brain and diagnose it, those are medical doctors, radiologists, and neuroradiologists.
Yes.
And if we're going to talk to somebody about what's used in the field to diagnose certain things or evaluate certain things about the brain, radiologists and neuroradiologists with regards to being able to diagnose and treat, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So you said that you saw a couple things. He's got severe mental illness. Nobody questions that, right? Like anybody who, with the evidence we have, with the history we have, it also, whether the jury knows it or not, but generally with true mental illness, we see it exactly the way it found itself in Bryan Cahill, those early adolescent years. That's typical, right?
Yes.
And with regards to the damage in his brain, the way he is right now, we can't say it's the mental illness. We can't say it's the drugs. We can't say it's the vascular disease or the hypertension. We can't say it's I don't know where smoking, I know how where smoking fits on in somewhat, but smoking can damage the brain. That can be seen as well, right?
Yes, and it causes other medical issues.
We can't take any of those and say, okay, this is the reason Bryan Cahill's brain is damaged.
Correct.
But what we have today in this courtroom is what we have, right?
Yes.
I mean, Bryan Cahill, regardless of the reason, his brain is damaged the way it is today. There's no going in his brain and fixing it.
You can't fix the damage that's done, but you can address the symptoms that arise from it.
You can do so through, you said therapy?
Correct.
Medication?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know who's been treating him in the jail?
Specifically, no.
So you don't know that Dr. Trina Bivens, a psychiatrist, is treating him in the jail?
I didn't know that specifically.
You would agree with me over the records, though. I mean, over many decades, healthcare professionals have been working with Bryan Cahill trying to get him, and I know this isn't the proper term, I'm just saying, like, trying to get him right.
Yes.
I mean, decades.
Yes.
But with regards to the effects, I get it. We can do therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Yes.
There is an area that cognitive behavioral therapy won't help, though, right? Personality disorders can't be helped through cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
I don't know that I know research related to personality disorders and CBT. It's a lot tougher.
Okay, we'll go back to that in a second. But what we have with Bryan Cahill, as it is now, I mean, there's not a surgery we go in and we can add repair brains.
Right.
Okay. So with regards to what we're dealing with now, today, on January 9th, 2021, his brain is what it is, regardless of why.
Of course.
I want to talk, and I'll probably finish up a little bit here, but with regards to personality disorder, I think you told the jury that you saw evidence of personality disorder. I don't want to misquote you. You used the right terms. I don't. What did you say with regards to personality disorder?
He has criteria that he meets for probably an unspecified personality disorder that has paranoid features, antisocial features, and narcissistic features.
I want to talk to you a little bit about that. What is a personality disorder?
It's essentially a maladaptive behavior pattern, sort of getting through life maladaptively, doing things that make other people angry, both at home and at work in multiple locations, and it's pretty rigid and unrelenting.
They used to have different titles, right?
They still do.
Antisocial personality disorder, I mean, that used to be, what, sociopath?
They're different things.
I want to talk to you a little bit about that diagnostic criteria then. We'll start with antisocial, then we'll go to narcissistic, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. And from the DSM-5, so with regards to antisocial personality disorder, the criteria that you're talking about that he meets some of, first off, we have to have the conduct disorder early on, right?
If he meets the full criteria, which he doesn't. I don't see indications of a conduct disorder prior to the age of 15.
You don't?
No.
Okay. Okay. What would be what would rise to the level of conduct disorder for you?
You have to meet certain criteria. There are, I believe, 3 symptoms which involve usually hurting other people, stealing from people, setting fires, hurting animals, hurting individuals, those sorts of things.
So prior to the age of 15, if Bryan Cahill had been hurting animals with a buddy of his named Andy, that would have been 1 point.
That would have been a symptom, yes.
If he had been
That assumes a fact, not an evidence.
He's an expert. If he had been shoplifting at the age of 10 and his dad had to take him back to return it, that would have been a point, right?
That could be, yes.
Using drugs?
Using drugs is typically not a conduct disorder symptom.
Running away from the house?
Yes.
Then we move to the diagnostic criteria where we're looking at, I think this is where you said, I do agree that he meets some of these, right?
Correct.
Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors. Meets that?
Correct.
Deceitfulness, lying,
yes.
Using aliases for his own profit.
I don't know about aliases, but lying. There's been deception, yes.
Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead.
Yes.
irritability and aggressiveness as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults.
Certainly irritability and aggressiveness, yes.
Reckless disregard for safety of self or others.
Yes.
Lack of remorse is indicated by being indifferent to or actually rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another.
Yes.
I mean, we see that when he blames his mom for the way he treats his own mom, right? Well, you haven't watched the jail visitations.
Correct.
I mean, all of those we see in Bryan Cahill, right?
Yes.
With regards to narcissistic personality, has a grandiose sense of self-importance.
Yes.
Is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love.
I don't know that I see that.
If you were played a jail call where the defendant is cussing about nurses because they think of him as an alpha male, would that fit into that? A grandiose belief of importance? Brilliance, beauty, power?
I mean, not necessarily.
Believing that he or she is special and unique?
Potentially, yes.
Sense of entitlement?
Yes.
Takes advantage of others?
Yes.
Lacks empathy?
I think for some things, yes.
With regard to those personality disorders, out of all the things we've talked about, those are the ones where they're really, I mean, we can talk about medication, we can talk about cognitive behavior therapy, but with regard to the personality disorders, those are the ones where we really don't have good treatment in any form or fashion for that.
It's harder to treat than your typical mental illness, yes.
And this is my last area. I'm sorry, doctor. I almost didn't talk to you about this. With regard to Bryan Cahill, as he sits here today pleading guilty to the felony, you understand his options are TDC or probation, right?
Yes.
And I want to talk to you just a little bit because I think a lot of us in society think we have these facilities that anyone with mental illness, that has mental illness, that we have these facilities that we can just send them to, right? And it doesn't really work that way, right?
Are you talking about in the free world?
I'm talking about in the free world.
We do have facilities you can send people to.
Right.
It's not that easy.
Well, it's not that easy, and it's only in certain circumstances, right?
Yes.
If Bryan Cahill had not been competent, we could have sent him to a facility, a restorative facility, if it was an outpatient, where they were restored competency and then returned him to court, right?
Yes.
If someone's found not guilty by reason of insanity, they will then go to a state facility where they will be treated and quite frankly, have you been part of some of the reviews that they do every 2 years?
Not for 20 years.
Okay. But you know, they're doing reviews for that
right.
every couple of years, and then the burden's on the state of Texas to try to keep that person in that facility, and that's for insanity.
Correct, yes.
The other way is the civil commitment process. Do you have much experience with those?
Not a ton, but you see it in these circumstances.
And that's where, again, the state of Texas has to go in front of the court and try to get someone committed, and that's reviewed on a regular basis. And that part is where family members can come in and try to keep those people from staying in facilities too, right?
The family can come in and give their say, yes.
Now, are you familiar with the treatment facilities within the TDC system?
To some extent, yes.
Are you familiar with the workings of UTMB within the mental health facilities?
Yes.
You understand that we have specific facilities that are set up solely for the treatment of mentally ill inmates?
Yes.
Have you been to those?
I have not, but many of the individuals I've seen have been there, so I'm familiar with those units.
Never went down to Skyview and Rusk and looked at it?
I've not just looked at it, I mean, I've evaluated people in those facilities, yes.
When you were doing your work as a fellow, were you ever assigned, did you ever go work in the prison system?
No.
And we can talk to somebody else who can really hash out that, but you'd agree with me as far as the prison system goes, for mentally ill individuals, it's no longer what we think about of put them in a cell and throw away the key the way that probably society would fear. We now recognize it and have amazing programs set up. Some people actually end up living and having more treatment there than they did in the free world, right?
I don't know that that's true. I don't have data on that.
Okay. We should talk to someone within that system to understand what programs are available.
Correct.
I'll pass the witness.
One more question, Dr. McGarrahan. You looked at the imaging that was done of Mr. Cahill. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does it show image evidence of head trauma?
I think that's going to have to be...
You looked at it. Did you see it?
The report indicated that there were abnormalities.
No further questions.
Thank you.
By the defense, she's released.
Okay, counsel, approach, please. We're going to take a 5-minute recess. Members of the jury, please be back in the jury room in 5 minutes.
All right.
All right, court will be in recess. If the witness if it's burdensome for the witness to return tomorrow morning, we need to discuss this because my understanding is that there's one juror who cannot stay past 6, and so I don't know if the witness can't be here tomorrow, I don't know that we can wrap up all of his testimony and the hearing by 6. My understanding that there's a daycare issue and that juror can't. I'm just going to make sure that that's still the case for tonight. It has been for previous days, but I will double check that, but that could cause a problem. Well, I just want to figure out whether I'm sending the jury home now or not. Can be back in the morning. Yes, sir. I'll have the 7:05 hearing, and then we'll. What's your last witness? Does the state still have rebuttal witnesses? We also have that juror number 1 who's got a flight tomorrow night. Can we have the witness come forward, please? Sir, please raise your right hand for me. Do you swear or affirm that your testimony will be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please have a seat. All right, we're on the record outside the presence of the jury. Mr. Cahill is present. Counsel, also present counsel for the state. Mr. Mitchell?
Judge, I do believe on this witness that I'd probably ask the defense to prove up under 702 his area of expertise and how they're sponsoring having it.
Mr. Haynes?
What's your name, sir?
Jeffrey David Lewine.
And Dr. Lewine, how are you employed?
So I'm a professor of translational neuroscience at the Mind Research Network. I have adjunct appointments in the departments of neurology and psychology at the University of New Mexico. I'm the chief executive officer of a small business, the Center for Advanced Diagnostics, Evaluation, and Therapeutics. And I'm the director of research for Beyond Barrier Therapeutics, which is a small pharmaceutical company developing a novel treatment for TBI.
What are the educational achievements that allow you to work in the field that you're working?
So I have bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in neuroscience, and also was a director's fellow in neuroscience and biophysics at Los Alamos National Laboratory.
What that had to do with atom bombs?
They have a biology division, so you can use physics to look at the brain, and that's what we were doing.
And how long did it take you to complete the education that qualifies you for the work you do today?
About 20 years total.
And so how long have you been working in the field subsequent to the completion of your education?
About 27 years.
So you were asked in this case to review some images of Mr. Cahill's brain to make an evaluation of him based on that. Is that correct?
So from a neuroscientific perspective, I was asked to review magnetic resonance imaging data and to complete quantitative analyses on those data and put that within a neuroscience framework.
So you were not trying to diagnose a medical condition?
That is correct. I'm not a medical doctor. I do not make diagnoses. I do not treat patients.
Or to construct a plan of treatment?
Correct.
All right. Tell the court what you did to do the qualitative, or I should I say qualitative or quantitative?
Both.
So then that'll make it easy. I'll just say analyses. All right. So what were you asked to look at to do the analyses that you did in this case?
So I was asked to look at the magnetic resonance imaging data from a qualitative neuroscientific perspective. Were there any things that were grossly abnormal? As part of that, we also engaged Dr. Travis Snyder, who is a neuroradiologist, to look at those data as well. In addition, we did quantitative computer-based analyses of brain volume and something known as diffusion tensor imaging, which looks explicitly at the white matter of the brain.
In addition to looking at the images, did you look at anything else pertaining to the case?
Yes, so I also looked at the client history, basically the same documents that Dr. McGarrahan looked at to try and put things within an appropriate neuroscientific framework to look at potential etiologies from a neurobiological perspective.
Right. And so you were present here in the courtroom when she recited the list of things that she looked at. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so is it your testimony that you looked at those same things?
I looked at all those things. I did not interview Mr. Cahill, nor did I interview his mother.
Did you review Dr. McGarrahan's notes of her interviews with those people, or no?
So I did not have the notes of her interviews with those individuals. I did have a summary score sheet of her neuropsychological testing.
That's the 31 testing instruments. There's the word.
Yes, so again, I only had the summary scores, not the raw data.
All right. And based on all of that, were you able to reach a conclusion in this case?
Yes, so the imaging data, both the qualitative and the quantitative imaging data, show evidence of a range of abnormalities. And from a differential perspective, some of those abnormalities are most consistent with hypertension. Some of those abnormalities are multidimensional in origin, can't explicitly sort out everything that's going on. Some of those abnormalities are more consistent with things like mental illness and traumatic brain injury than they are with substance abuse. But again, we cannot make a diagnosis based on the imaging data alone, and we cannot make a full differential interpretation based on the imaging data alone.
So you're not trying to diagnose a physical traumatic injury to the brain?
Correct. We're simply looking to see, are these data potentially consistent with A, B, C, or D?
And however, you can look at the images and see if what you see is consistent with traumatic injury.
Yes, sir.
And do that.
Yes, sir.
Now, I know my friends at the States table are concerned about a PowerPoint that you have together, possibly used with your testimony.
Yes, sir.
And you have put together a PowerPoint, right?
Yes, sir.
How many slides are there on it?
I believe there's 30, 31.
All right. And they are intended as a demonstrative aid for the assistance of the jury in understanding your...
Yes, sir.
Do you think the images contained within the PowerPoint will aid the jury in understanding the things that you tell them if the court decides you can testify.
Yes, sir.
In what way?
So there are images of the actual data, the results of the analyses. There's an earlier set of just tutorial images just explaining brain function in general.
So that you can explain to the jury the rather complex process of taking the images and then doing the analyses that you're going to be telling them about. Is that
Yes,
correct?
sir.
I mean,
Yes, sir.
This is not a uncomplicated matter. It helps to have going to go with your words.
Yes, sir.
Are you able to summarize your findings in a short statement here for the benefit?
Yeah, so again, what the data shows that there's clear evidence of brain compromise, multiple gross structural findings, multiple findings on quantitative analyses, many differential contributors. So again, his medical history is a contributor. It is likely that history of mental illness is a contributor. There probably are some contributions from substance abuse. The data are consistent with a contribution from head trauma, although they're not diagnostically specific for that.
You also show any kind of an abnormal growth within.
Yes, so there's actually evidence of what's known as, what's most likely an acoustic neuroma.
What is an acoustic?
It's basically, it's a non-cancerous tumor around the 8th cranial nerve, which is the auditory nerve.
That contribute or not?
So again, it's a relevant finding. I do not believe that it's relevant to the legal aspects of this case. Yes, sir.
All right, Your Honor, that concludes our offer of proof. We believe that the doctor should be allowed to testify, and so the PowerPoint slideshow is helpful to the jury.
Mr. Mitchell?
Judge, I think at least at this point, they're probably the court and the state should probably. I mean, I think the court should have a copy of this PowerPoint as we go forward. So if defense wants to offer that for record purposes at this time, that's probably a way to do it. I'd also like to make sure the copy I've got is what they're trying to introduce. One I've got is 39 pages. Is that right? No idea. How's it different than the other one? So one slide added or one slide different?
Judge, may I make a comment?
Right.
In the version that I was planning to show, because of just the way this is.
Who are you talking to right now?
To you, actually.
Okay, can you give me a second then?
Oh, sure.
If you can just tell me, it's just one page, tell me which one. That's fine. Not that one. I appreciate it.
All right, so, doctor, let me show you. This, a paper copy of the PowerPoint that you're proposing should be used, I'm proposing should be used. Yes, except once I saw just the physical layout of the screen here, so there are a couple of slides that have 3 images on them. I have added a slide that just has one of those images blown up, so it'll be easier for the jury to see. And I've done that. There's, I think, 4 slides where there are multiple images on one slide, and I just have an additional slide now showing those same images blown up. Right. So for the record, we'll offer.
So, if I may take the witness on board, so just so I understand what you're saying, that's 39 pages. The one that you want to show is going to have 4 additional pages?
Yeah, but I'll kind of just skip through the originals. So again, there's a slide in there, for example, that shows the acoustic.
Sure. I'm just asking. You're adding 4 pages to 39. You got 43 pages
Yes.
in whatever it is you want the judge to allow.
Yes, sir.
All right. I don't have objection for record purposes of this hearing.
All right, it's admitted for record purposes. You want to cross-examine the witness?
I would with regards to, well, yes, Judge, I think I need to. All right. Dr. Lewin, I want to make sure I'm clear on exactly what it is you're telling the court. You are contemplating testifying as a neuroscientist, correct?
That is correct, sir.
And we'll come back to it here in a second. But with regards to your PowerPoint, one of the things you say is, you make this statement, I am not a medical doctor. I do not give medical opinions, nor do I engage in medical diagnosis or treatment, correct?
That is correct, sir.
So with regards to your qualifications to make opinions, I just want to make sure I'm clear on a couple things before I start talking. I plan to ask you a lot of the same questions I did Dr. McGarrahan, but I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right questions. I feel like I heard you say, I'm not a doctor, I don't diagnose. But at the same time, I also heard you tell Mr. Haynes, I looked at an MRI, I saw an acoustic neuroma. This is what an acoustic neuroma does to the brain. Am I wrong on that?
No. So Dr. Snyder, so I looked at the brain, saw a mass. Dr. Snyder looked at the brain, saw a mass. Dr. Snyder believes it's an acoustic neuroma from a medical perspective. I concur with that from a neuroscientific perspective.
What do you mean a neuroscience? I mean, I get that a doctor can look at an MRI and a doctor can diagnose you with having an acoustic neuroma. How does what do you mean by neuroscientific perspective?
So again, I'm not making a diagnosis. I'm not making a treatment recommendation. I'm simply saying, here is an abnormality, and based on the literature, published literature, that is consistent with an acoustic neuroma.
Okay. So let me make sure we're clear. A radiologist, and specifically a neuroradiologist, are trained to look at those images, decide what they see, interpret that into this is what this is.
From a medical perspective.
Okay. You feel that you can do that, right? In this example, you can look at an MRI and say that is an acoustic neuroma, and that's not diagnostic?
I'm saying it's consistent with an acoustic neuroma from a neurobiological perspective. Dr. Snyder has said it is also consistent with an acoustic neuroma, and I routinely rely on information provided to me by neuroradiologists.
Let's do that again. Dr. Snyder, who is a neuroradiologist, a medical doctor, a diagnostician, looked at these images, correct?
Correct.
And there's multiple in this, and said, I see in these images, in one of them, an acoustic neuroma.
He sees a mass that's consistent with an acoustic neuroma.
A mass consistent with an acoustic neuroma, okay? And he can do that because he is a medical doctor and can diagnose that what an acoustic neuroma is, right?
He can write a medical report that says this is an acoustic neuroma, yes.
Okay. And then you say, okay, Dr. Snyder, then this is an acoustic neuroma. Or are you telling us that you have the ability to look at MRIs and tell people what's in their head?
No, I have the ability to look at it from a neuroscientific perspective and say there is an abnormal mass here, and based on the literature, that's consistent with an acoustic neuroma. I'm not doing it from a medical treatment perspective.
And I don't want to mince words, but isn't that the same as me looking at on a, you know, if my kid comes to me with a rash and me get on Google and saying, from a internet perspective, that looks consistent with this type of rash?
Again, not from a medical treatment perspective, but if you had training to look at rashes, again, based on your knowledge in the literature, you could say this is what it looks like from my perspective. My perspective is not a medical perspective.
And isn't that the reason why you have to have Dr. Snyder do that? Is because you can't testify to reading MRI.
Exactly. I'm not testifying to interpreting the MRI from a medical perspective. But as a neuroscientist, as someone who spent his life studying the brain, I can look at the MRI from a brain perspective. And the objectives are different there. Dr. Snyder does it for the purpose of medical diagnosis and guiding treatment.
And that's why, I think my question was clear. That's why you have to have Dr. Snyder and refer to his report in here, because Dr. Snyder's the one who's trained to look at MRIs and identify things within the brain.
From a medical perspective.
Which is diagnosing.
Yes.
Okay. And when we look at these images in your PowerPoint, we'll get to the rest of them here in a little bit, but in your PowerPoint, like the first one, did you do a neuroradiological evaluation? Or did he?
He did a neuroradiological evaluation. I did a neuroscientific evaluation.
Okay. Well, let's stick to your PowerPoint. At the top of the first brain picture, I'm assuming that's Mr. Cahill, right?
Mm-hmm.
It says neuroradiological evaluation, right?
Yes, that information was provided to me by Dr. Snyder.
And just so this doesn't take as long, when you can you say yes or no?
Sure.
All right. It says neuroradiological evaluation, correct?
Yes, sir.
It says Mr. Cahill has ectasia of the right vertebral artery with some mass effect on the medulla. Now, does that sound to you like it's consistent with, or does that sound to you like a diagnosis?
Read it again, please.
Mr. Cahill has ectasia on the right vertebral artery with some mass effect on the medulla.
And that's from Dr. Snyder.
Okay. These are often benign and do not require treatment. That's treatment, right?
That's also from Dr. Snyder.
Okay. May I approach, Judge?
Yes.
Hey, which part of this is yours?
Again, I routinely rely on information from Dr. Snyder, and those...
Can you point to me the part that's yours?
And these four images, none.
Okay, great.
It's all from Dr. Snyder. Actually, this is mine. That one.
So you put Mr. Cahill has a left temporal subarachnoid cyst?
No, that's from Dr. Snyder.
And then you put an EEG to evaluate possible epileptic activity may be warranted?
Yes.
So this is you basically telling Bryan Cahill that he needs to go get an EEG?
No, I'm just saying it may be warranted.
Isn't that what a doctor would do? If I went to a doctor and he said, oh, you got a subarachnoid cyst, wouldn't he say, you know what, let's do an EEG?
You might, yes.
Okay. So that's treatment.
No, it's not treatment, it's still diagnosis. I evaluate patients with epilepsy all the time. I am sent patients from many places. I give that information back to a referring physician who then may or may not act on it.
The small bleeds, Mr. Cahill has several microhemorrhages. Is that you or is that Dr. Snyder?
Dr. Snyder.
We skip forward a couple pages. What's this one say? Can you read it from there?
I can't see it from there.
If you would, give the, read the very first word. Or you know what, read the title of that one for the court.
Treatment options in the future.
Is that you or is that Dr. Snyder?
It's a combination.
I'm sorry. What's the very first word in that?
Treatment.
Okay. What can you not do?
I'm not making a recommendation for treatment. I'm simply expounding on what the literature says the treatment options are.
You did make a report, right?
Yes, sir.
The defense has that report?
Yes, sir.
Is this your report? Is this exactly what it looks like now? That's the one I got.
Yes, sir.
Well, you need to look at it, right? It's not just the first page.
Yes.
That's your report?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many of the images in that report are also in this PowerPoint? There's one. No, come on.
Leave all of them.
That's in the PowerPoint?
Yes, there's some additional images.
The other one in the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
And that actually identifies what you and what Dr. Snyder's diagnosing that with, right? Okay, go to the next one. That's in the PowerPoint?
Yep.
That one?
Yep.
Same saying this is what it is?
Yep.
Go to the next one.
Yep.
Same thing?
Yep.
Go to the next one. That in the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
That table 1 in the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Keep going. That in the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Go to the next one. That in the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Slide number 2. These are statements, I guess, on what you did.
Yes, sir.
I would be able to ask you, hey, Dr. Lewin, what'd you do? And you'd probably answer just like this, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The next one says, my qualifications. If I asked you, hey, what are your qualifications to do what you do? This would be your answer?
Yes, sir.
All right. If I asked you, what's neuroscience? This would be probably what you'd say, right?
Yes, sir.
Oh. If I asked you what your areas of scientific expertise would be, you'd list all these?
Yes, sir.
But you treat people for these?
No, I do scientific publications.
I am a PhD neuroscientist. On that slide, if I asked you the question, hey, what are you doing and what are you not doing?
Yes.
Okay. Prior and current academic appointments, I mean, that's pretty much your CV right there, right?
Yes, sir.
The one called My Career, where you have some bullet points on all the things you've done.
Yes, sir.
Then we get into these where a lot of it, you'd agree with me, is, I mean, I know it's not clip art. You didn't go on the internet and pick these out, did you?
No, but it's demonstratives on just how the brain functions.
Did you get them from textbooks?
Textbooks, yes.
Okay. But some of these are also in your report?
Those the demonstratives are not in the report.
The picture of the dress where people see it different colors?
Yeah. Not in the report.
This one says magnetic resonance imaging, and it has pictures of, these aren't Bryan Cahill's brain,
No.
right? And these are just pictures of an MRI.
Just to explain how MRI works.
Okay, so you want that behind you while you're talking about the MRI. Has nothing to do with the case, right?
It's just explaining.
This one has bowls of ice cream?
Yes, and it's explaining why we do quantitative analysis.
All right. And that's kind of consistent through here. you've got one of a control group. If I asked you to explain the control group, you'd probably say those things, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, when we get to the images, I mean, how far deep are we? About 15, 20 pages deep now?
Yes, sir.
These are the images. You said most of them are in that report,
Yes.
if not all of them. The only one that's different is you added a different look on one of them.
Yes, sir.
And this is where we start. These are Dr. Snyder's, except for the one where you put some information. These are Dr. Snyder's findings.
Yes, sir.
Are these, when we start getting into these, the statistics and the neurotypical?
So this is explaining the quantitative analysis.
Right. Are those in the report? Are these demonstrative?
So this is demonstrative. They're demonstrative, but then they transition to the ones in the report.
Right, because table 1, we see that again. This DTI 21 of 48. I mean, these are just pictures of the regions for DTI. These aren't Bryan Cahill's, are they?
No, so these are Bryan Cahill's data. These are demonstrative fiber tracks.
And those are
with his data then put
right.
Illustrate
It's different colors on the ones that were affected, but these aren't actual images of his DTI.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And so that the court kind of understands what I think, where I think we're at is, what happens is they come to you and they say, we've got a defendant or a plaintiff, right? Oh, I forgot to ask you. I thought I recognized some of these. Do you do a PowerPoint presentation for plaintiff's lawyers that included some of these slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Dr. Snyder looks at the MRI, says, this is what I see. This is how I diagnose it. What you do is you take those images and you put them into a computer that does analysis, and then you analyze the results.
I do additional analyses, yes.
All right. And do I understand that you want to make opinions as to the structures that were found, or the things that were found in his brain, or is it that you want to make an opinion with regards to the analysis that was performed, volumetric in DTI?
I want to present the full picture of everything that was found.
So are you saying that you want to tell the jury, look, I put the imaging in the computer, this is what popped up, and these are the abnormalities that I found, right?
Yes.
Okay. Then you want to say Dr. Snyder looked at these MRIs, and Dr. Snyder, the neuroradiologist, found this stuff in his imaging.
Yes, which is also consistent with what I saw from a neuroscience perspective.
I know you keep saying it's consistent with yours, but again, you're not a radiologist.
That's correct.
Okay. I think that's all I have before we start arguing, Judge.
All right, thank you, sir. You may stand down. All right, the state have any objections to the proffer?
Yes, Your Honor. I feel like I'm kind of doing two things here with the PowerPoint and the proffer. I think there's an argument that could be made that Dr. Lewin is not in a position to interpret the MRIs to this jury. However, I'm not going to object to that in the form of the report and his testimony, but I am going to hold that objection when it comes to this PowerPoint, if that makes sense. And the differences in the pictures in the PowerPoint and the report that he's given. So I don't have an objection to his testimony. I don't have an objection to his report as I understand it. I'm going to 100% object to this PowerPoint.
The entire
document? Reasons.
The entire document?
Yes, Your Honor. I mean, as it stands right now.
The demonstrative aid.
Yes, Your Honor. I mean, as it stands right now. The demonstrative aid. Yes, Your Honor. 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 And of course, he said, I can give my reasonings as we go.
Yes, please. And can I get a copy of the report?
I'm sorry, Judge, I thought one was put in evidence for record purposes.
For record purposes.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, the report. My bad. What number am I on? Can I approach, Judge? We'll offer states 399 for record purposes at this time.
Objection for record purposes.
Submitted for record purposes, 399. Any additional argument, Mr. Mitchell?
Yes, Your Honor. First off, I think the main argument is this is duplicative information that is contained in that report. If they wanted to pull out a couple of pictures that they believe would help the jury understand something that's not in that report, that's one thing. What the court has in front of it is PowerPoint that's 43 pages long. The information that's relevant to this defendant is in that report, so it's duplicative. Under 403, Judge, the delay that a PowerPoint presentation in this courtroom to this jury is 100% unwarranted. It's not necessary, and it should be kept out under 403. Also, under 705D, if the court will notice the pictures of the brain imaging in this case, this witness testified, this is Dr. Snyder's work. This is a radiologist, neuroradiologist's work. Now, the way it's presented in that report, I'm not objecting to, but the way it's presented in this PowerPoint, where it is I'm going to argue, is a diagnosis made by a radiologist and neuroradiologist who is in a position to make those diagnoses, with all the wording saying that this is what he has, that is improper under 705D for this witness to testify to or to offer. Also, page, 4 or 5, where he says, I am a PhD neuroscientist. The second paragraph starts out with, I am not a medical doctor. I do not give medical opinions, nor do I engage in medical diagnosis or treatment. The court looks at the final pages of this PowerPoint. It starts with treatment options. Those are final opinions given by someone who's an expert in a different area. So I'm going to object to that. And I don't believe in the proffer that Mr. Haynes elicited any type of treatment information from this expert. I believe he told the court, I did volumetric and DTI analysis of this defendant's brain, and I plan on offering testimony with regards to my findings. We have no objection to that. We actually aren't going to object to something I think we could with regards to the images and the conclusions in that document, saying it's an acoustic neuroma, saying, whatever. But this PowerPoint goes far, far beyond that, and we've got an objection to that as it stands right now. Now, if they want to pull out a few of these pictures for him, we can reconsider that. But and then finally, Judge, so it's a 705D. It's also a 702. And quite frankly, Judge, if the court allows this witness to do this presentation in the manner he's suggesting, where he just sits up there with a PowerPoint, I understand there'll probably be one question and then a discussion about a PowerPoint. It will be done in almost an educational manner, and we feel that would be a comment on the weight of the evidence if this court allows this witness to testify in a way that no other witness is allowed to do. For those reasons, we would object to the PowerPoint only.
Does either side intend to offer 399? Jury?
I have no objection to 399 through Dr. Lewin.
Do it for the jury. I think it's more useful with the new to that PowerPoint is slides, but Dr. Lewin has examined these images and going to tell the jury what he sees there and what they mean. We have 43 of those slides, but I think it's pretty Cahill's brain to be able to say, okay, this is the one I looked at and this is what I see here. I think that's more useful to the jury in conjunction with the report than the report by itself, which by its very nature contains a lot of scientific jargon which may be difficult for the jury to understand if they just read it. I don't have any objection to offering the report, and we'll certainly do that in the presence of the jury, but I think we ought to be able to explain it. It is taken from Mr. Cahill's brain that the doctor used to make his analysis. To reconstruct our PowerPoint presentation to real comments that.
And I think that's probably a fine remedy that we wouldn't have an objection to.
Are there any treatment recommendations in states 399? I don't believe I saw any. Sorry?
No. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm not persuaded by most of the objections, but for treatment options, I actually have some reservation about repeating a medical doctor's diagnosis, and I think it comes down to whether are these facts and data that the expert is relying on to form an independent opinion, or is he merely parroting or adopting a medical doctor's expert opinion? I think one would be permissible, the latter would not be. And I think that that's even more evident with respect to treatment options, because there's no doubt in my mind that a treatment option is an expert opinion of a medical doctor, and it's not an independent opinion of a scientist. So in my view, at least at a minimum with respect to the treatment options, the expert would be parroting another expert's opinion as opposed to forming an independent opinion of his own for which he's qualified to make. So at this point, I'm going to ask Mr. Haynes and Ms. Ross and the witness to prepare a new PowerPoint eliminating the references to treatment options. I'm going to limit the testimony to that extent as well. I may make a few modifications to my ruling in other areas. I don't know that I will, but it's possible. I just want to deliberate about it a little bit and maybe look at some case law. But at a very minimum, I'm not going to allow the expert opinion about treatment options. All right?
And I'm intending to ask him about that. About treatment options.
All right. So no testimony about treatment options or opinions about treatment, either substantively or within the proposed demonstrative aid.
All right. I will prepare a PowerPoint.
All right. Very well. We'll be in recess till tomorrow at 8:30.
Very well.
Thank you.